Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've been debating whether to post this for a while now. I'm not the type who believes in monsters or cryptids, or whatever you want to call them. I'm just a regular guy who likes hunting, fishing, and camping with my buddies. But what happened last November in Colville National Forest has completely messed with my head, and I need to get it off my chest. It was November 7th, 2022. Me, Tyler, Derek, and Mike had been planning this mule deer hunting trip for months. We're all experienced outdoorsmen, grew up in rural Washington, been hunting since we were teenagers, know the woods like the backs of our hands, or at least we thought we did. We chose Lonesome Hollow in the northeastern part of Colville because Mike's uncle had great luck there a few years back. The place isn't exactly remote by Washington standards, probably about 2 hours from the nearest town with a decent grocery store. But it's tucked away enough that we figured we'd have the deer to ourselves. The day started normal enough. We loaded up our trucks with our gear at around 6 in the morning. Tents, sleeping bags, coolers full of beer and food, and of course, our rifles. The drive up was beautiful. Fall in Washington state is something else. The larches were this brilliant gold color, and there was just enough chill in the air to make you feel alive. We got to our spot around 2 in the afternoon. It was this nice little clearing about a quarter mile from an old logging road with a small creek running nearby. Perfect spot. Flat ground for the tents, water source close by, and good sight lines into the surrounding forest where we'd be hunting. We spent a couple hours setting up camp, gathering firewood, and getting everything situated. The afternoon hunt was uneventful. We split up, each taking different sections of the woods, but none of us saw anything worth shooting, just some old tracks and deer scat. Not unusual for the first day, though. We figured we'd have better luck in the morning when the deer would be more active. We got back to camp as the sun was setting, got a fire going, and started cooking dinner. Tyler had brought some elk steaks from his hunt last season, and we had potatoes wrapped in foil cooking in the coals. We were drinking beers, telling the same old hunting stories we always tell, giving each other shit like guys do. It was perfect. Until about 9 o'clock, I was just tossing another log on the fire when Derek held up his hand. "You guys hear that?" he asked. We all went quiet. At first, I didn't hear anything besides the normal nighttime forest sounds, the creek bubbling, wind in the trees, the occasional far-off owl. But then it came through clearly, this low, moaning sound from somewhere up the slope behind our tents. It's hard to describe exactly what it sounded like. It wasn't a wolf or coyote howl. I've heard plenty of those. It wasn't an elk bugle or a deer call either. It was this weird, almost human-like moaning that rose and fell in pitch. It would start low, then rise to almost a wailing sound, then drop back down. It lasted maybe 15 seconds, then stopped. "What the hell was that?" Mike whispered. "Probably just a cougar," I said, but I didn't believe it. I've heard mountain lions scream, and this wasn't that. We sat there for maybe 5 minutes, straining to hear it again, but there was nothing. Eventually, we convinced ourselves it was just some weird echo or animal sound and went back to our beers and bullshitting. But I noticed we were all talking a little quieter, and everyone kept glancing up toward the dark ridge behind us. Around 10:30, Tyler got up and said he needed to take a leak. He grabbed his headlamp and walked toward the creek, which was maybe 50 yards from our camp. The rest of us were debating whether to turn in or have another beer when Tyler came crashing back through the underbrush. Even in the firelight, I could see his face was white as a sheet. "We need to go," he said, his voice tight and shaky. "We need to pack up and go right fucking now." Mike laughed nervously. "What's going on, man? You see a bear or something?" Tyler was already grabbing his backpack and shoving things in. "There's something down by the creek, something big." Like a moose? Derek asked. No, Tyler said, and I remember the way his hands were shaking as he tried to roll up his sleeping bag. It was, I don't know what the fuck it was. It was hunched over the water. When it heard me, it stood up. It was huge, man. Fucking huge. I felt this cold feeling washing over me. Tyler isn't the type to get spooked easily. He's the guy who goes into the abandoned buildings the rest of us won't enter. How big are we talking? I asked. 8 feet at least, maybe more. I couldn't see it clearly, but it was massive, covered in dark hair. He looked up at me, and I'll never forget the genuine fear in his eyes. Guys, it wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand up and stay up like that. Before any of us could respond, there was a crashing noise from the hillside behind our tents. Not like an animal moving through brush. This was heavy, deliberate movement, breaking branches, thudding footsteps. We all froze. Mike whispered, "What the fuck is that?" I had my headlamp in my pocket, one of those bright miner's lights that can light up a whole hillside. I flicked it on and aimed it up the slope. What I saw in that beam of light still gives me nightmares. About 100 yards up the hill, moving along the ridgeline, was a large, dark figure. It was clearly walking on 2 legs, but it was hunched forward, with these long arms that swung in front of its knees as it moved. It was covered in what looked like dark, matted hair or fur. The way it moved was so unnatural, fluid, but wrong somehow, like its joints bent in ways they shouldn't. It was moving fast, much faster than a human could navigate that rough terrain in the dark. Each footfall made this heavy stomping sound that we could feel as much as hear. It crossed the ridge in seconds, then disappeared over the far side. For what felt like an eternity, nobody moved or spoke. The only sound was our breathing and the crackling of the fire. Then Mike whispered, "Holy shit." That broke the spell. We all started grabbing our stuff, not even bothering to pack properly. I just shoved my sleeping bag and clothes into my backpack, grabbed my rifle, and was ready to go. Derek was frantically trying to take down his tent. "Leave it," Tyler hissed. "Leave the fucking tents. We need to go now." "What about the fire?" I asked, my voice not sounding like my own. "Fuck the fire," Mike said. "It's been raining all week. It won't spread." We grabbed our backpacks and rifles and started moving back toward the logging road where we'd parked our trucks. I don't think I've ever been so scared in my life. Every shadow looked like a monster. Every sound made my heart feel like it was going to explode. We had to navigate by moonlight and our headlamps. Every few minutes we'd stop and listen, terrified we'd hear that thing coming after us. But the woods behind us were quiet, almost too quiet, like every animal was hiding. It took us almost 45 minutes to reach our trucks, a hike that should have taken 15. We were moving carefully, trying not to make noise, constantly scanning the trees around us. When we finally saw the vehicles, I nearly cried with relief. We threw our gear in the backs and piled in, Tyler and Mike in one truck, me and Derek in the other. As I was starting the engine, Derek grabbed my arm. "Look," he whispered, pointing back toward the trail we'd just come down. At the edge of my headlight's reach, something moved in the darkness, just a shadow shifting against the trees, there and gone so quickly I couldn't be sure I'd seen it. But I wasn't waiting to find out. I threw the truck in reverse, spun it around, and we got the hell out of there, Tyler and Mike right behind us. We drove 2 hours straight back to Derek's place without stopping once. Nobody talked much on the drive. What was there to say? We'd all seen it. We'd all heard it, and none of us had any explanation that made sense. The next day, in the safety of daylight, we tried to rationalize what we'd experienced. Maybe it was a bear, maybe it was some weird light trick or shadow, but deep down, we all knew what we saw wasn't anything normal. I've spent hours researching online since then. I've read about Sasquatch sightings in the Pacific Northwest, watched videos, looked at supposed footprint casts. Nothing I've found fully matches what we saw that night, but some of it comes close. We left probably $2,000 worth of camping gear in those woods. None of us has suggested going back for it. None of us has suggested going hunting again, period. Tyler won't even talk about that night anymore. I don't know what we encountered in Lonesome Hollow. I don't have a name for it. All I know is that it was real. It was big. And it wasn't anything that's supposed to exist in those woods. And every time I close my eyes, I see that hulking silhouette moving across the ridge, its arms swinging in that strange, unnatural way. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I'm not sure I would believe it myself if I hadn't been there, but I know what I saw, and I know I'm never setting foot in Lonesome Hollow again. Story 2. I've been sitting on this experience for over 20 years now. My wife Barbara and I have only told a few close friends and family members, and most of them think we're either making it up or that we mistook a bear for something else. But I know what I saw, I know what we both saw, and it wasn't a bear. It was the summer of 2000. Barbara and I had just retired the year before. I'd put in 40 years at the lumber mill in Kamloops, and she'd worked as a nurse for almost as long. We were finally enjoying our golden years, doing all the things we'd put off while raising our kids and working our fingers to the bone. We loved camping. It was something we'd always done, even when the kids were little. Now that it was just the two of us, we'd invested in a decent camper. Nothing fancy, but comfortable enough for a couple of 60-somethings with creaky joints. We had our favorite spots around British Columbia, but that summer we decided to spend 2 weeks at Logan Lake, about 40 minutes from Kamloops. It's beautiful country up there. Pine forests, clear water and good fishing. We'd been there plenty of times before without incident. This time was different though, very different. The first few days were perfect, weather was great, fishing was decent, and we were enjoying the peace and quiet. But on the fourth day, I noticed some of our food was missing. Not a lot. Just some bacon, a few hot dogs, and a bag of marshmallows. I figured maybe a raccoon had gotten into our cooler when we weren't paying attention. I told Barbara to make sure everything was secured at night. The next morning, more food was gone, and this time, so was one of my flannel shirts that I'd left hanging on the line to dry. Barbara's sweater was missing too. Now, raccoons don't steal clothes, so I was getting concerned. I thought maybe some kids from a nearby campsite were playing pranks. We hadn't seen any other campers nearby, but I figured they must be around somewhere. That night, I made sure everything was locked up tight. We even brought the cooler inside the camper with us. I slept poorly, waking up at every little sound, but eventually dozed off sometime after midnight. When we woke up the next morning, I couldn't believe my eyes. Our entire campsite was trashed. The folding table was flipped over, our camp chairs were scattered, the fishing gear was all over the place, and even our little aluminum boat had been dragged about 10 feet from where I'd secured it. Whatever did this was strong, really strong. That boat wasn't heavy, but it wasn't light either. It would take at least 2 grown men to move it like that. "George, I'm scared," Barbara said, her voice shaking. "I think we should leave." I was spooked too, but I'm stubborn, always have been. "It's probably just some punks," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "They're just trying to scare us off. We're not going to let them win." We spent the morning putting everything back in order. I found some of our food scattered in the woods about 50 yards from our site, wrappers torn open, cans dented and punctured. This wasn't kids, this was something else. That night, we stayed inside the camper with the doors locked. We had a battery-powered radio playing softly, trying to pretend everything was normal. Around 11 at night, something hit the side of our camper with a thud. Barbara jumped and grabbed my arm so hard she left marks. Then it happened again. Thud, harder this time. I grabbed the flashlight and my hunting knife. I'd left my rifle at home, something I was now deeply regretting. "Stay here," I told Barbara. "Don't you dare go out there," she hissed. Before I could decide what to do, there was a tremendous crash, and the window on the door shattered inward. Barbara screamed. I swung the flashlight toward the window and caught a glimpse of something moving away from the camper. In the dirt below, the window was a rock the size of a grapefruit. We huddled together in the back of the camper all night, too terrified to sleep. I kept the flashlight and knife close. Every snap of a twig outside made my heart race. At first light, we assessed the damage. The window was completely destroyed. I covered it with a garbage bag and duct tape as a temporary fix. We were both exhausted and on edge. "We're leaving today," Barbara announced, her voice firm. I wanted to agree with her, but something in me needed to know what we were dealing with. "Let's give it one more night," I said. "If anything else happens, we'll go first thing in the morning, I promise." She wasn't happy, but she agreed. We spent the day close to camp, taking turns watching our surroundings while the other one napped. Nothing unusual happened during the daylight hours. That night was the worst yet. We were both jumpy, starting at every sound. Around 1 in the morning we heard it, a strange mumbling sound outside the camper. Not quite animal, not quite human, like someone talking with a mouth full of marbles, but deeper, more guttural. "What is that?" Barbara whispered, clutching my arm. "I don't know," I admitted. The mumbling continued, moving around our campsite. Sometimes it sounded like one voice, sometimes like 2 or 3, overlapping and responding to each other. It wasn't English or any language I recognized, just weird, unsettling sounds that made the hair on my arms stand up. This went on for maybe 20 minutes, then stopped abruptly. The silence afterward was almost worse than the sounds had been. Neither of us slept a wink. When dawn finally came, I cautiously opened the camper door, knife in hand. The campsite was undisturbed this time, but something caught my eye in the soft dirt near our fire pit. Footprints, enormous bare footprints. I called Barbara over and we stared at them in disbelief. They were clearly feet, 5 toes, arch, heel, but massive. I wear a size 12 boot, and these prints were easily 5 inches longer than my foot. The stride between them was huge too, much longer than I could step. Whatever made these was big, really big. "That's it, George," Barbara said, her voice surprisingly calm. "We're leaving now." I should have listened to her. God, I wish I had, but I've always been too curious for my own good. "Let's just go fishing this morning," I suggested, "out on the lake. We'll be safe there, and we can decide what to do after we've calmed down." Barbara reluctantly agreed. We quickly gathered our fishing gear, grabbed some sandwiches Barbara had made the day before, and headed out to our little aluminum boat. I made sure we had our car keys with us, just in case. The lake was calm that morning, and being out on the water did help us relax a bit. We didn't catch much, but it was peaceful. For a few hours we almost forgot about the strange events of the past few days. It was around 11 when Barbara nudged me and pointed back toward shore. "George," she said quietly, "look at our campsite." I turned around, and that's when I saw it. There, moving around our campsite, was something big. From our position about 100 yards offshore, I could see it clearly. It was tall, 7 or 8 feet at least, and covered in reddish-brown hair or fur. It moved on 2 legs, completely upright like a human, but there was nothing human about it. Its arms were long, hanging almost to its knees, and its head sat directly on its shoulders, no neck to speak of. We watched, frozen as it moved around our campsite, picking things up, examining them and tossing them aside. It flipped our cooler over with what looked like almost no effort, sending the contents scattering. Then it grabbed one of our camp chairs and just pulled it apart, the aluminum frame bending like it was made of wire. "Oh my God," Barbara whispered. "Is that a Sasquatch?" I couldn't answer. I'd never believed in such things, but what else could it be? It wasn't a bear. Bears don't walk upright like that, don't have those proportions. It wasn't a person in a suit. No costume could capture that fluid, powerful movement. The raw strength it displayed was terrifying. We sat there, barely breathing, watching it ransack our camp. I don't know if it was angry or just curious. It seemed methodical, like it was searching for something specific. It opened our tent, ducked its massive head inside, then backed out and moved to the camper. It tried the door, which thankfully I'd locked, then peered through the broken window. After what seemed like forever but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes, it straightened up, looked around, and then, I swear this is true, it looked directly at us. Even from that distance, I could feel its gaze. My blood turned to ice. For a long moment, it just stared. Then it made that mumbling sound we'd heard the night before, turned, and walked into the forest. Not hurrying, not sneaking, just calmly walking away, disappearing among the trees. As soon as it was out of sight, I started the boat's motor with shaking hands. Barbara was crying silently. We sped back to shore, and I've never moved so fast in my life as when we beached that boat and ran to our campsite. We didn't bother packing properly. We grabbed our wallets, keys, phones, and whatever clothes were easiest to reach. I threw them in the car while Barbara started it up. We left everything else behind, the cooler, the fishing gear, even the camper. We just didn't care. We drove straight to town, not stopping until we reached a diner in Kamloops. We sat there drinking coffee, trying to process what we'd seen. People must have thought we were crazy. Two disheveled seniors looking like they'd seen a ghost. We called our son from the diner and asked him to drive up with his truck to help us retrieve the camper the next day. We didn't tell him why, just that we'd had some trouble. When we went back, the three of us in broad daylight, our campsite was even more destroyed than when we'd left it. The camper door had been ripped open and everything inside was torn apart. Our son thought we'd been vandalized and wanted to call the police. We let him think that. How could we explain what we'd really seen? It's been over 20 years now, and I still have nightmares about that thing staring at us across the water. I've read about Sasquatch sightings since then, trying to make sense of our experience. Some descriptions match what we saw, others don't. All I know is that something was out there, something big, strong, and intelligent, something that shouldn't exist, but does. We never went camping again after that summer. Some things you just can't unsee. Some fears follow you home. And sometimes late at night, I still think I hear that strange mumbling outside our bedroom window. Story 3. I've never told this story to anyone outside my immediate family and closest friends. Even now, 27 years later, I get goosebumps thinking about it. This happened when I was 10 years old, living with my family in a small house just outside Darington, Washington. Our property backed up against this huge wooded hill with a pasture stretching behind our backyard. It was beautiful country, the kind of place where kids could run free all day. But there were always these weird whispers among the adults. Growing up, I'd overhear fragments of conversations at community barbecues or when parents gathered on porches, talk about strange lights on the hillside, unexplained noises in the night, and something they called the mountain giant. As kids, we mostly rolled our eyes. Adults were always trying to scare us to keep us from wandering too far into the woods. Classic small town stuff, right? That's what I thought, until that day in July. It was a Thursday afternoon, hot as hell even for summer. School had been out for a few weeks, and me and my two best friends, Jason and Mike, were bored out of our minds. We decided to walk the dirt road that ran along the north end of our pasture, hoping to catch frogs at the pond about half a mile from my house. We were just walking, kicking rocks, talking about nothing important, normal kid stuff. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a weird shadow or maybe a deer, but it wasn't. There was this figure, I guess you'd call it, walking slowly across the field about 200 yards away. I remember grabbing Jason's arm and pointing. We all stopped dead in our tracks. This thing was huge. Not like, oh, that's a tall guy. Huge. I mean massive. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. What really stands out in my memory was its hair. Long, shaggy white hair that hung over its back and shoulders like old rope. It wasn't moving fast, just this steady, deliberate walk on 2 legs with these long arms swinging at its sides. What the hell is that? Mike whispered. None of us moved. Then it stopped. It just stopped, like it sensed us watching. Then it turned. I'll never forget how it turned to face us, not quick and startled like a deer, but slow and purposeful. I couldn't make out its face clearly at that distance, but I could feel it looking at us. And then it did something that made my blood freeze. It walked right up to this 6-strand barbed wire fence, the kind that's about 4 feet high that separates properties around here. And it just lifted one massive leg and stepped over it. Just stepped over it like it was nothing. Like stepping over a garden hose. I don't remember which one of us screamed first, but suddenly we were all running. I've never run that fast in my life. My lungs were burning, and I could hear Jason and Mike right behind me. We didn't stop until we reached my backyard, where we collapsed in the grass, gasping for air. "Did you see that?" I kept asking. "Did you see that?" We argued about what we'd seen. Jason insisted it was just a really tall guy with white hair. Mike thought maybe it was someone in a costume playing a prank, but I knew better. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human. The way it moved, the size of it, it was something else entirely. We made a pact not to tell our parents. They'd either not believe us or worse, forbid us from going back to the pasture at all. And despite being terrified, there was part of me that wanted, needed, to know more. For the next few days, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing that figure in my dreams, stepping over the fence with impossible ease. I'd wake up sweating, convinced I could hear heavy footsteps outside my window. My mom noticed something was wrong, but I blamed it on a scary movie I pretended to have watched at Jason's house. About 4 days after the sighting, curiosity finally overcame fear. We decided to go back, in broad daylight, armed with my dad's old Polaroid camera, to look for evidence. The 3 of us rode our bikes to the dirt road, then walked cautiously to the spot where we'd seen the creature cross the fence. "Look!" Mike suddenly shouted, pointing at the barbed wire. Caught on the sharp barbs were several long, coarse white hairs, exactly the same color as the hair we'd seen on the creature. My hands shook as I carefully removed them from the wire. They were thick, almost like horsehair, but different somehow. Coarser, and with this weird, hollow quality. I wrapped them in a tissue and stuffed them in my pocket. That night, I showed the hairs to my dad. I didn't tell him about the creature, just said I found them on the fence and wondered what animal they came from. He barely glanced at them before saying, "Probably just horsehair, Danny." But there weren't any white horses in our area, not a single one. I knew every horse in every pasture for miles. That's how small our community was. I kept those hairs in a shoebox under my bed for years. Eventually, they disappeared during a move, and part of me has always regretted not having them analyzed when I got older. About a week after finding the hair, I decided I needed to face my fear. I told myself I was being stupid, letting my imagination run wild. So I packed a peanut butter sandwich, an apple, and a jar of Kool-Aid, and headed to the small pond near where we'd seen the creature. It was a beautiful spot, surrounded by alders and wild blackberry bushes. I spread out my old Star Wars blanket and tried to enjoy a normal summer day. I'd been there maybe 20 minutes when I heard it, branches snapping in the woods behind me, not the light crack of a squirrel or small animal, but heavy brakes, like something big was moving through the underbrush. I froze, sandwich halfway to my mouth, then I smelled it. I don't know how to describe it exactly. A musky, sour smell, like wet dog mixed with something rotting and something else I couldn't identify. It was overwhelming, making my eyes water. Nothing I'd ever encountered smelled like that. I didn't look back. I just ran. Left everything, my blanket, my bag, my food, and sprinted all the way home. My mom yelled at me for coming back so upset and muddy, but I couldn't tell her why. I just said I thought I saw a bear, which earned me a lecture about wilderness safety. It took 3 days before I could convince Jason to come back with me to get my stuff. When we finally did, what we found chilled me to the bone. My blanket was half buried, like something had tried to hide it. My bag was torn to shreds, not like an animal looking for food, but like something had deliberately ripped it apart. And my drink jar was shattered, the plastic pieces pressed deep into the mud. "We need to go," Jason whispered. "Right now." For the rest of that summer, I stayed close to home. I made excuses not to go to the pasture or the woods. I kept my window locked at night, even though my room was sweltering in the July heat. I'd lie awake listening, convinced I could hear heavy footsteps circling our house. Years later, when I was 16, my dad and I were cleaning his hunting gear when he suddenly said, "You remember those white hairs you showed me when you were a kid?" When I nodded, he hesitated, then said, "I didn't want to scare you then, but I've seen things out there too." He told me about hunting raccoons on the mountain above our pasture one night and hearing heavy footsteps circling him in the dark. Whatever it was, it stayed just out of sight of his flashlight beam. He packed up and left and never went night hunting in that area again. As I got older, I started hearing more stories from neighbors. Mrs. Carlson talked about whales echoing off the hills on certain nights. Not an animal sound, but not quite human either. Old man Peterson swore he saw glowing eyes peering into his shed one night, too high up to be any normal creature. And the Jacobson kids found weird structures of twisted branches high up in trees where no human could have placed them. I'm 37 now. I've got my own family, and we live about 15 miles from my childhood home, still near Darington. When my kids ask to go exploring in the woods, I tell them the same thing. Respect the forest and be home before dark. They think I'm being an overprotective dad, but some fears stay with you. I've researched what I saw that day. Some call it Sasquatch or Bigfoot. The locals just called it the mountain giant. I don't know what it was, but I know what I saw. That massive figure with the white hair, effortlessly stepping over a fence that would challenge most men. The hair on the barbed wire. The smell. The destroyed belongings. Sometimes when the wind blows just right across our property, I catch a whiff of that same musky, sour smell, and I hurry my kids inside, lock the doors, and sit up a little later than usual, listening to the sounds of the forest outside our windows. Because I know the mountain giant is still out there, moving silently through the wilderness around Darington, watching and waiting. BC, Story 4. I've held this in for so long, but I need to finally get this out there. I keep telling myself it was just a bear or my imagination playing tricks, but deep down, I know what I saw wasn't normal. It's been nearly 15 years now, but I remember it like it was yesterday. It happened during our annual family camping trip at the headwaters of Clear Creek near Dubois, Wyoming. My extended family would get together every summer. My parents, 3 sets of aunts and uncles, and all us cousins would take over a section of the campground for a week. There were 9 of us cousins that year, ranging from 9 to 14 years old. I was 12. That particular day was hot but beautiful, clear blue sky, not a cloud in sight. The adults were busy setting up the campsite, drinking beers and preparing food while we kids were getting antsy. My older cousin Jake suggested we climb the hill behind our campsite to check out the view. We were all bored, so everyone agreed. The hike up wasn't too difficult, but it was steep enough that we were all sweating by the time we reached a good lookout point about halfway up. The view was amazing. You could see the entire valley, the creek winding through it like a silver ribbon. The forest spread out everywhere, dense and green. I remember feeling so small looking out at it all. After catching our breath and pointing out landmarks, we started doing what kids do, finding ways to entertain ourselves. Jake and my cousin Ryan started rolling rocks down the hill, watching them bounce and crash through the underbrush. Soon we were all joining in, finding the biggest rocks we could manage and sending them tumbling down, competing to see whose rock would go farthest. We must have been making a ton of noise. 9 kids shouting and laughing, rocks crashing through the brush. Looking back, that's probably what drew its attention. I was struggling to push a particularly large rock when my youngest cousin Emma suddenly froze. "What's that noise?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. We all stopped and listened. At first, I didn't hear anything over the sound of our heavy breathing. Then I heard it. A crashing sound from across the ravine, like something big moving through the trees. We thought maybe it was one of our rocks that had rolled farther than we realized, but the sound continued, deliberate and rhythmic. "There's something over there," whispered Jake, pointing across to the opposite hillside, maybe 300 feet away. We all squinted, scanning the tree line. That's when I saw it. I still get goosebumps thinking about it. Between two large pine trees stood something. At first I thought it was a person, but as my eyes focused I realized it was way too big. It was standing upright on two legs, completely still except for a slight swaying or rocking motion. The sun was positioned behind it, so its face was in shadow, but I could clearly see it was covered in golden brown hair, long and shaggy. "Do you guys see that?" I whispered, not taking my eyes off it. "Holy shit," breathed Ryan, who was 14 and the oldest. "What is that thing?" "It's a bear," said Jake, but his voice wavered. "It has to be a bear." "Bears don't stand like that," Emma said, clutching my arm so tight it hurt. She was right. This thing was standing perfectly upright like a human, but it was huge, at least 8 feet tall. Its shoulders were impossibly wide, solid and powerful looking. The hair covering its body caught the sunlight, giving it an almost glowing appearance. None of us moved. We barely breathed. I remember my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. The creature didn't move either, apart from that slight rocking motion. It was just watching us. I couldn't see its eyes, but I could feel its gaze. It was studying us, I'm sure of it. "We need to go," whispered my cousin Lily, her voice trembling. "We need to go right now." But none of us moved. It was like we were frozen in place, locked in some kind of staring contest with this thing. I don't know how long we stood there, probably only a minute or two, but it felt like hours. Then my youngest cousin started crying quietly, and that broke the spell. Ryan, trying to be brave, picked up a rock and threw it in the creature's direction. It fell far short, but the action seemed to startle the creature. It took a small step back into the tree line, but remained visible, still watching us. "Let's go," Ryan said firmly, grabbing Emma's hand. "Everyone stay together and walk slowly back down the trail." We started backing away, not taking our eyes off the creature. When we reached the bend in the trail where we'd lose sight of it, panic took over. Someone, I don't remember who, shouted, "Run!" And suddenly we were all sprinting down the hill, tripping and sliding in our haste. I fell hard at one point, scraping my knee badly on a rock. I still have the scar. My cousin Lily helped me up, and we continued running. I remember the terror of thinking that thing might be right behind us, but I was too scared to look back. We burst into the campsite, all talking at once, out of breath and terrified. The adults looked up from their camp chairs, alarmed by our panic. "There's something up there," Jake shouted, pointing back toward the hill. "It was huge." "It was watching us," Emma cried. My Uncle Mike set down his beer. "Whoa, whoa, slow down. What did you see?" We all started talking over each other again until my dad whistled loudly. "One at a time. Ryan, you're the oldest. What happened?" Ryan, still catching his breath, explained how we were rolling rocks and then spotted something across the ravine. It was standing upright, like a person, but it was huge, 8 feet tall at least. It was covered in this golden brown hair, and it was just watching us. My Uncle Mike exchanged looks with my dad. "Sounds like you kids saw a bear. They stand up sometimes to get a better look." "It wasn't a bear," I insisted. "Bears don't stand like that for that long, and it had really long arms, and it was swaying back and forth." "And its shoulders were super wide," added Jake. "Wider than Dad's." My Uncle Mike was the biggest guy I knew, so this was saying something. The adults didn't seem convinced. My Aunt Julie suggested it might have been an elk or a moose, but we all knew that wasn't right either. My Uncle Tom even joked that maybe we'd seen the legendary Bigfoot, which made the other adults laugh, but none of us kids found it funny. "Look," my dad finally said, clearly trying to calm us down. "Whatever it was, it didn't bother you, right? It stayed on its side of the ravine." We nodded reluctantly. "Then it was probably just as scared of you as you were of it. We'll avoid that hill for the rest of the trip, okay? No reason to panic." But I could tell the adults were a little unsettled by how genuinely frightened we all were. Later that afternoon, my Uncle Mike and my dad hiked partway up the hill with rifles, supposedly to check for aggressive wildlife. They came back saying they hadn't seen anything unusual, but I noticed they didn't let any of us kids wander far from the campsite for the rest of the trip. That night around the campfire, the adults tried to distract us with ghost stories and s'mores, but all 9 of us cousins kept looking over our shoulders into the darkness beyond the firelight. I barely slept that night, straining to hear any unusual sounds outside our tent. The weird thing was, as scared as we all were, there was also this strange excitement. We kept whispering to each other when the adults weren't listening, comparing details of what we'd seen. We all agreed on the main points. It was huge, covered in golden brown hair, standing upright and watching us intently. "Did you see its face?" Lily asked at one point. "No," I said. "It was in shadow." "I think I saw its eyes," Jake whispered. "They looked intelligent." That detail sent shivers down my spine, because even though I hadn't seen its eyes clearly, I'd felt its gaze. It hadn't been watching us with the mindless curiosity of an animal. There had been purpose behind that stare. The next morning, Ryan and Jake wanted to go back up the hill to look for footprints, but the adults absolutely forbade it. We spent the rest of the trip fishing, swimming in the creek, and playing games at the campsite. We tried to have fun, but none of us ventured far from the adults, and we all kept glancing toward that hill. On our last night, I woke up around 3 in the morning needing to pee. Our tent was at the edge of the campsite, closest to the trees. I was terrified to unzip the tent, but my bladder was about to burst. I woke up my cousin who was sleeping next to me, and she agreed to stand by the tent while I went to the nearby portable toilet our parents had set up. As I hurried back from the toilet, I heard a sound from the tree line, a deep, low, whooping noise that didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. I froze, my heart practically stopping. Then came a heavy cracking sound, like a massive branch being snapped in half. I ran back to the tent so fast I practically dove through the opening. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to my cousin. She nodded, eyes wide. "What was it?" "I don't know," I said, but deep down, I did know. It was our visitor from the hill, checking on us one last time before we left. We never told the adults about the sounds I heard that night. Somehow, it felt like a private communication between us and whatever was out there. The next morning, as we packed up to leave, I noticed something odd. 3 large rocks stacked on top of each other at the edge of our campsite, near where I'd heard the sounds. I'm certain those rocks hadn't been stacked like that the day before. It's been 15 years, and I've never gone back to Clear Creek. The cousins and I still talk about it sometimes when we get together, but we've stopped trying to convince the adults of what we saw. They've dismissed it as a bear sighting or overactive imaginations, but all 9 of us know what we witnessed that day. I've researched Bigfoot sightings in Wyoming since then and discovered that the Clear Creek area has had several reports over the years. Golden brown hair is apparently a common description for Sasquatch in that region. Sometimes I wonder if it's still there, watching other hikers and campers from across that ravine. Whatever it was, it changed me. I still go camping and hiking, but I'm always aware that the wilderness holds secrets, things that don't fit neatly into scientific categories, and sometimes when I'm alone in the forest and hear an unusual sound, I freeze and listen carefully, wondering if I'm being watched again by something ancient and unknown that calls these mountains home. Story 5. I've never been the type to believe in monsters or cryptids or whatever you want to call them. I'm 63 years old, spent most of my life working as a nurse, and I consider myself pretty level-headed. My husband James says I'm the most rational person he knows, or at least I was, until that day in June 2018. James and I retired to Seward, Alaska about 5 years ago. We'd visited on vacation years before and fell in love with the place, the mountains, the water, the fresh air. Most of our friends here are boat people. They fish, they sail, they spend their days out on the water, not me. I've always preferred solid ground under my feet. While James goes out fishing with his buddies, I take to the trails. That morning started like any other. I packed my small day pack with water, trail mix, a small first aid kit and my bear spray. Alaska isn't like the suburbs where we used to live. You have to be prepared out here. I kissed James goodbye as he headed to the marina and told him I'd be back by 3 o'clock. The trail I chose that day was one I'd hiked many times before. It winds through the forest about 4 miles from our cabin. Nothing too strenuous, just enough to get my heart rate up. The weather was perfect, sunny but cool, around 55 degrees, the kind of day that makes you glad to be alive. I remember noticing how quiet it was that morning. Usually the forest is alive with sounds, birds chirping, squirrels chattering, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But that day, there was this strange stillness that I didn't think much about at the time. About an hour into my hike, I came across something I hadn't noticed before, a clearing that looked like an old logging road or fire break. It cut through the forest like a scar, maybe 30 feet wide, with tall grass growing in the middle. I decided to follow it, thinking it might lead to a new viewpoint or something interesting. I'd walked maybe 200 yards down this clearing when it happened. The memory is burned into my brain like a photograph. I was adjusting my backpack strap when I heard a crashing sound from the tree line on the opposite side of the clearing, maybe 50 yards ahead of me. At first, I thought it was a moose. We see them all the time around here, and they can make a racket moving through the brush. But what burst out of those trees wasn't a moose, it wasn't a bear, it wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. This thing landed in the middle of the clearing on 2 legs. It was upright, like a person, but much, much bigger. In that first moment, all I registered was the size. It was massive, at least 7 feet tall, maybe more, and broad, so impossibly broad across the shoulders. Then it crouched down, and I froze. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The thing bent over and seemed to pick something up from the ground. I couldn't see what it was from where I stood, and honestly, I wasn't focusing on that detail. I was too busy trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It stood up again, and that's when I got a better look. It was covered in dark hair, not fur like a bear, but hair, longer in some places, especially around the shoulders. Its arms were long, hanging lower than a person's would, with large hands. The head sat low on the shoulders, almost like it didn't have much of a neck. The whole encounter lasted maybe 10 seconds, but time seemed to stretch. It never looked in my direction, thank God. After picking up whatever it had found, it walked, not lumbered, not shuffled, but walked, back into the trees on the opposite side. The way it moved was so fluid, so purposeful, not like an animal at all. Once it disappeared into the tree line, the spell broke. I turned and ran. I ran faster than I have in decades, not looking back, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached the main trail, and even then, I only slowed to a jog. By the time I got back to our cabin, my lungs were burning and my legs felt like jelly. James wasn't home yet, and I was grateful. I needed time to process what I'd seen. I showered, made a cup of tea with shaking hands, and sat at our kitchen table trying to make sense of it all. What had I seen? A bear standing on its hind legs. No, bears don't move like that. A man in some kind of costume. Out here, miles from any road, it made no sense. And why would someone in a costume be out in the middle of nowhere just to pick something up off the ground and walk away? When James came home that afternoon, I said nothing. What could I say? Hey, honey, I think I saw Bigfoot today. He'd think I was losing my mind. So I kept it to myself, tried to act normal, and eventually convinced myself that I must have been mistaken. The light playing tricks, or my mind filling in blanks with something fantastical. That's what the rational part of me wanted to believe. But I never went back to that trail. I found other places to hike, always making sure to stay on well-traveled paths, and I started carrying my bear spray in my hand rather than in my pack. Life went on. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. I never told a soul about what I'd seen. I'd almost managed to convince myself it was nothing, when the second incident happened, almost 2 years later. It was a warm evening in May 2020. James and I were sitting on our deck, enjoying a glass of wine as the sun started to set. The air was still, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink. We were talking about nothing important, maybe the garden or plans for the weekend. Then we heard it, a scream. No, that's not the right word. A roar, a howl. I don't know how to describe it. It came from beyond the tree line, maybe half a mile away. It started low, then rose in pitch before tapering off. It was loud, so loud that both of us jumped in our seats. It lasted maybe 5 seconds, but it felt much longer. James looked at me, his face pale. "What the hell was that?" he asked. I couldn't answer. My mouth had gone dry, and my hands were trembling so badly I had to set my wine glass down before I dropped it. "Martha, you okay?" James reached for my hand. It was probably just I don't know, a mountain lion or something. I shook my head. Mountain lions don't sound like that. I'd heard mountain lions before. This was different. Maybe a bear then, he suggested, but he didn't sound convinced. The thing is, James has lived in Alaska his whole life. He grew up hunting and fishing in these woods. He knows every animal's sound there is to know, and I could tell from the look on his face that he'd never heard anything like this before either. We sat in silence for a while, both listening intently, but the sound didn't come again. Eventually, we went inside, locking the door behind us, something we rarely did. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying both incidents in my mind. The creature I'd seen in the clearing, and now this sound. Were they connected? It seemed impossible, yet deep down, I knew they were. A few weeks later, I was watching TV while James was out fishing. I was flipping through channels when I stumbled across a documentary about unexplained phenomena. I was about to change the channel when they started playing audio recordings of supposed Bigfoot calls. My blood ran cold. The sound coming through our TV speakers was identical to what James and I had heard that evening on our deck. Identical. The same pitch, the same modulation, the same bone-chilling quality. I sat there, remote in hand, frozen in place as they played the recording again. There was no denying it. It was the same sound. When James got home, I finally told him everything about what I'd seen that day in the forest 2 years earlier and how the sound on the documentary matched exactly what we'd heard. To his credit, he didn't laugh or dismiss me. He listened, really listened. "You know," he said when I finished, "the native elders around here have stories about something they call the hairy man." I always thought they were just stories, like their other legends. We talked late into the night. James shared that one of his fishing buddies, an older Tlingit man, had once told him about an encounter his grandfather had had with something in the woods, something tall and covered in hair that walked like a man but wasn't a man. I've spent my whole life believing in what I can see, touch and prove. I've dismissed ghost stories and monster sightings as the product of overactive imaginations or misidentifications. But what I saw that day wasn't my imagination, and that sound wasn't any known animal. I don't go hiking alone anymore. James and I stick together when we're out in the woods, and we don't stay out after dark. Call it paranoia if you want, but until you've seen something that shouldn't exist standing 30 yards away from you, you can't understand how it changes your perspective. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. Most days, I struggle to believe it myself. But I know what I saw, and I know what I heard. There's something out there in the Alaskan wilderness, something that science hasn't classified or explained, something that walks upright like a man, but isn't a man. Something that screams in the twilight with a voice that doesn't belong to any known creature. I don't know what to call it. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the hairy man. The name doesn't matter. What matters is that it's real. And once you know that, you can never look at the forest the same way again. Story 6. I've been hesitating to write this for almost 20 years now. I've never told a soul about what happened. Not my hunting buddies, not my wife, nobody. They'd think I was crazy or making it up for attention. But I need to get this off my chest, and maybe someone here has seen something similar. It was late October 2004. I remember because my oldest had just started kindergarten that fall, and I was taking advantage of a rare free day to scout for the upcoming deer season. I've been hunting the deep woods of Tyler County, Texas my whole life. My dad took me there as a kid, and I know those woods like the back of my hand, or at least I thought I did until that day. The weather was perfect, cool but not cold, maybe 55 degrees with a light breeze. I'd parked my truck before sunrise at my usual spot near the old logging road that borders the Natchez River watershed. I'd been walking for about 3 hours, marking promising spots on my GPS and checking trail cameras I'd set up the previous month. Around 10 in the morning, I reached a ridge overlooking a steep, narrow canyon I'd never fully explored before. It was rugged terrain, not where most hunters go, which is exactly why I thought it might hold some monster bucks. I found a good spot to sit against a pine tree, broke out my thermos of coffee, and started glassing the opposite hillside with my Nikon binoculars. I'd been scanning methodically for maybe 15 minutes when I noticed movement about 150 yards away across the canyon. At first, I thought it was a bear. We get black bears in East Texas, though they're not common. Through my binoculars, I could see a sapling shaking and patches of what looked like black fur moving behind it. I adjusted my position to get a better view, thinking I'd at least have a cool bear story to tell. But when the animal moved into a small clearing between two stands of oak trees, my heart literally stopped for a second. I remember the coffee mug slipping from my hand, but I didn't even care as hot coffee soaked into my pants leg. What I was looking at wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before in 20+ years of hunting these woods. The creature was huge, easily over 7 feet tall. It was standing upright but bent forward slightly, picking something off the ground. Maybe wild grapes or acorns. There's plenty of both in those woods in fall. Its entire body was covered in dull black fur, darkest on the arms and legs. Along its back, I could clearly see a line of silver-tipped hair running from the shoulders down to where I guessed the tailbone would be. My hands were shaking so bad I had to brace the binoculars against the tree to keep watching. These weren't cheap binoculars either. They're Nikons with 7 to 15 power zoom that I'd spent good money on. I cranked them to full magnification and the image was crystal clear. The thing had an odd-shaped head, like a dome or crown on top with no neck to speak of. It just seemed to merge directly into those massive shoulders. The shoulders themselves must have been at least 3 feet across, with powerful arms that hung lower than a human's would. I remember thinking how weird it was that I wasn't running away screaming. Instead, I was just frozen there, observing every detail like my brain was taking mental photographs. Maybe it was the hunting instinct kicking in. When you spot a deer, you freeze and observe, or maybe I was just in shock. For what must have been 15 minutes, I watched this creature methodically picking through the forest floor. It would occasionally straighten up to reach something higher, and the movement was so fluid, not jerky like you'd expect from a guy in a costume. When it reached up, I could see its hands clearly. They had 5 fingers like a human, but the proportions were off. The fingers were longer, and I could see that while the backs of the hands had fur, the palms were bare. It had these thick, long fingernails that looked almost like tools. At one point it turned its face in my general direction, and I got a good look. The face was dark, but not as furry as the rest of the body. More like a gorilla's face, but flatter. It had deep-set brown eyes with wide pupils, a flat nose with wide nostrils, and a wide mouth with almost no lips. The jaw was strong, but there wasn't much of a chin. Its forehead was deeply lined, almost like an old man's. The expression is what really got to me. It wasn't angry or aggressive. It wasn't even particularly curious. It just looked intelligent, aware. like it was going about its business, doing whatever giant forest creatures do on Tuesday mornings when nobody's watching. Then something changed. The creature seemed to cock its head slightly, like it heard something. I hadn't heard anything, but a few seconds later, there was a faint sound from higher up the slope. Maybe a branch breaking or rock shifting. I'm still not sure. What happened next is burned into my memory. The creature made a sound. Not a growl or a howl like you'd expect from an animal. It was this sharp, metallic ping sound, almost like hitting a tuning fork. It was so out of place in the forest that it made the hair on my arms stand up. After making that sound, the creature turned and started walking uphill away from me. Its stride was long and smooth, like it was gliding almost. Each step covered way more ground than a human could, but there was no rushing or stumbling on the steep hillside. It moved powerfully, but with this eerie silence. No crashing through underbrush, no snapping twigs, just this massive thing flowing through the forest like it was made of smoke. Within maybe 30 seconds, it had reached the ridgeline and disappeared over the top. I sat there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, unable to move. My hands were cramping from gripping the binoculars so tight, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. When I finally got my wits about me, my first instinct was to get the hell out of there. But another part of me, the hunter, the tracker, wanted to cross that canyon and look for evidence. Footprints, hair, anything that would prove what I'd seen was real. In the end, caution won out. Whatever I'd seen was heading away from me, and I had no desire to find out if there were more of them or if it might circle back. I packed up my stuff with shaking hands and took a different route back to my truck, constantly looking over my shoulder. The drive home is a blur in my memory. I remember stopping at a gas station and catching my reflection in the bathroom mirror. I looked like I'd seen a ghost. In a way, I had. I didn't go hunting at all that season. Told my buddies I had a back injury. By the next year, I'd almost convinced myself it had been a bear, or maybe some weird trick of light and shadow. But deep down, I knew better. I've been back to those woods many times since then, but never alone, and never to that specific canyon. I keep my hunting to the more accessible areas now, places where other hunters might be within shouting distance. For years, I've wondered if I should report what I saw, but to who? The local game warden would think I was nuts, same with the sheriff, and the internet is full of hoaxers and attention seekers posting fake Bigfoot stories. I didn't want to be lumped in with them, so I've kept it to myself until now. But sometimes when I'm in the woods and hear an unexpected sound, my mind goes right back to that morning, to that creature with its silver-streaked back and those intelligent eyes, to that bizarre metallic ping sound that seemed like communication. I've spent thousands of hours in those East Texas woods over my lifetime, and I've never seen anything like it before or since. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. Hell, if someone told me this story, I'd probably think they were full of it. But I know what I saw that day. The weirdest part? Sometimes I find myself hoping I'll see it again, just to prove to myself I'm not crazy. Other times, the thought of running into that thing, or worse, having it find me when I'm not expecting it, makes me break out in a cold sweat. I still hunt. I still love the woods. But something changed for me that day in 2004. I realized the forest I thought I knew so well had secrets I couldn't explain. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder if it's out there right now, making that strange, pinging sound to others of its kind, moving silently through the darkness of the East Texas woods. Story 7. I never thought I'd be afraid in my own backyard. That's the whole point of camping at home, right? You get the fun outdoor experience, but with the safety net of your house being right there. But what happened that night in September of 2007 changed everything for us. I still get goosebumps talking about it, and it's been 16 years. My husband Mike worked the midnight shift at the paper mill back then, and our older son Jake, 14 at the time, was going through that phase where camping was lame and he'd rather stay inside playing video games. But my youngest, Ethan, who was 7, was absolutely obsessed with camping and the outdoors. He'd been begging me for weeks to camp out. And with the weather being so perfect that September, not too hot, not too cold, I finally gave in. We live in Ashfield, Massachusetts, in an old farmhouse on about 3 acres that backs right up to a huge forest preserve. The woods behind our property are dense and go on for miles. There are old colonial-era mill ruins and some small cave systems back there. We'd always seen plenty of wildlife, deer, foxes, raccoons, the occasional black bear, but nothing that ever really bothered us. That evening started out perfect. We set up 2 tents in the clearing about 50 yards from our back porch. My bigger tent and Ethan's little blue dome tent that he'd gotten for his birthday. He was so proud of that tent and insisted on sleeping in it alone because he was a big boy now. I positioned his tent maybe 10 feet from mine so he'd feel independent, but I could still keep an eye on him. We gathered wood and built a small fire in our fire pit. I remember it was mid-September, maybe around the 15th or so. The air had that crisp fall feeling that makes you want to wrap up in a sweater and roast marshmallows, which is exactly what we did. Ethan was having the time of his life, telling me about the wilderness survival book he'd been reading at school and pointing out constellations as they appeared. It was probably around 8:30 when things started getting weird. We were sitting by the fire and I noticed a small rock, maybe the size of a quarter, roll into our campsite from the direction of the woods. I didn't think much of it. Could have been a squirrel or something. But then another one rolled in, and another. They weren't being thrown, just rolling in from the tree line about 30 feet away. "Mom, what's doing that?" Ethan asked, noticing them too. "Probably just some chipmunks or something, buddy," I said, but I was starting to feel uneasy. Then we heard the howls. Now we've had coyotes and foxes around our property for years. I know what they sound like. This wasn't that. It was deeper, longer, almost deliberate. It's hard to describe, but it made the hair on my arms stand up. It didn't sound close, maybe a quarter mile into the woods, but it was loud enough that we both heard it clearly over the crackling fire. "That's a weird coyote," Ethan said, scooting closer to me. "Yeah, it is," I agreed, not wanting to scare him by admitting I had no idea what it was. We heard it 3 more times over the next hour, and each time it sounded a little closer. I was getting nervous, but told myself I was being silly. We were in our own yard, for crying out loud. The house was right there, Jake was inside, my cell phone was in my pocket. There was nothing to worry about. By 10 o'clock, Ethan was yawning, and the weird howls had stopped, so I felt better about sending him to his tent. I tucked him in with his flashlight and stuffed dinosaur and zipped him up safely. I stayed up a bit longer, reading by the dying firelight before turning in myself around 11. I fell asleep pretty quickly, despite the unfamiliar sounds of being outdoors, the crickets, the occasional rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. Normal woods sounds that usually make camping so peaceful. I don't know exactly what time it was when I woke up. My watch said it was just after 3 in the morning. Something had pulled me from a deep sleep, but I wasn't immediately sure what. Then I heard it, cracking branches and heavy footsteps coming from the woods toward our campsite. My first thought was deer. We get them all the time, and they can sound surprisingly heavy when they're moving through underbrush. But as I lay there, fully awake now and listening intently, I realized the footsteps had a rhythm that didn't match a 4-legged animal. It was more like whoosh thump, like something walking on 2 legs, dragging or swinging something with each step. I held my breath, straining to hear, hoping it would veer off in another direction. It didn't. Whatever it was heading straight for our campsite, and it was big. Each footfall made the ground vibrate slightly, even through my sleeping pad. Then the smell hit me. Oh God, the smell, like a wet dog that had been rolling in roadkill, mixed with skunk spray and that heavy, musky odor you smell at the zoo near the big cat enclosures. It was so strong and sudden that I gagged and had to cover my mouth. The footsteps got louder, closer, until they were right outside my tent. I froze, paralyzed with fear. Then something bumped against the side of my tent. Not aggressively, but like something large passing by that didn't bother to go around. The whole tent wall pushed inward, and I could see the silhouette of something massive through the nylon. I was terrified, but managed to turn my head toward the small mesh window on the side of my tent. What I saw next will haunt me for the rest of my life. In the dim moonlight, I could make out a huge, dark figure standing between my tent and Ethan's. It was at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller, and incredibly broad, like a linebacker but bigger. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand like that. This thing was upright on 2 legs, with long arms that hung down almost to its knees. I couldn't make out details in the darkness, just this massive silhouette with what looked like shaggy fur or hair covering its body, and it was standing right next to my son's tent. Then, in one fluid motion, it reached down and grabbed the top of Ethan's little dome tent with what looked like a massive hand. It lifted upward, pulling the tent partly off the ground, and started shaking it. Violently shaking it, Ethan's screams cut through the night air, high-pitched, terrified screams that no parent ever wants to hear. "Mommy! Mummy! Something's got me!" I don't remember deciding to move. Pure maternal instinct took over. I lunged for my tent zipper, fumbling with it in panic, screaming at the top of my lungs. Let go of him. Get away from my son. The creature froze. It stopped shaking the tent and turned toward my tent. I couldn't see its face clearly, just a large, dark head turning in my direction. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds, it just stood there, still holding Ethan's tent partly off the ground, while my son sobbed inside. Then it let out a sound that made my blood run cold, a roar so deep and powerful that I felt it in my chest. It wasn't like any animal I've ever heard, not a bear, not a mountain lion. It was primal and furious, and so loud that I swear the windows of our house rattled even from 50 yards away. The creature dropped Ethan's tent, which collapsed partially as it hit the ground. Then it turned and crashed away into the woods, moving incredibly fast for something so large. Trees snapped and brush crushed under its weight as it retreated. I finally got my zipper open and practically fell out of my tent. I scrambled over to Ethan's collapsed tent on my hands and knees, tearing at the fabric to get to him. "Ethan, Ethan, baby, are you okay?" He was curled up in his sleeping bag, shaking uncontrollably and crying. One of the tent poles had snapped, causing half the tent to cave in, but thankfully he wasn't hurt, just absolutely terrified. I scooped him up, sleeping bag and all, and ran for the house. I didn't bother with our stuff, the flashlight, nothing. Just ran as fast as I could across the yard, constantly looking over my shoulder, terrified that thing would come back. We made it inside, and I locked every door and window, then called Mike at work, barely able to form coherent sentences through my panic. Jake had slept through the whole thing, but woke up when he heard us come crashing in. He thought I was crazy until he saw the state Ethan was in, still trembling and unable to speak. Mike came home immediately. We called the local police, but when they arrived about 20 minutes later, all they found were our abandoned tents. Ethan's was partially collapsed with a broken pole. They searched the wood's edge with flashlights, but found nothing except large, unusual footprints that the officer said were probably just a bear, though it's strange it would walk that way. But I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand upright for that long. They don't reach down and deliberately shake a tent. And they definitely don't let out roars that make your windows rattle from 50 yards away. We slept with Ethan in our bed for weeks afterward. He had nightmares for months. Even now, at 23, he refuses to go camping or even to be outside in our yard after dark. We never found out what it was that night. Some of our neighbors think I imagined it or exaggerated a bear encounter because I was scared. Others have quietly told me about strange things they've seen or heard in those woods over the years. All I know is that we don't use our backyard after sunset anymore. We sold the tents, and sometimes, on quiet fall nights when the windows are open, I still hear those unusual howls from deep in the forest, and I immediately close and lock everything. Whatever was out there that night, I'm convinced it's still there, somewhere in those woods, and I pray it never decides to visit our yard again. Story 8. I still can't talk about that night without getting goosebumps. It was October 2019, and I'd been looking forward to our annual camping trip with friends at Moran State Park on Orcas Island for months. There were 15 of us this year, all in our 50s and 60s, friends since forever, who've been doing this trip for over a decade now. It's usually the highlight of my fall. Campfires, hiking, catching up, and just getting away from the daily grind. We'd arrived Friday afternoon, set up our campsite, and had our usual first night cookout. By Saturday, we'd settled into that comfortable camping rhythm. Most of the group had gone hiking around Mountain Lake that morning, while a few of us stayed behind to relax. I'd brought my 2 terriers, Pepper and Max, who absolutely live for these trips, all those new smells, and the freedom to explore on their leashes. That Saturday night started out perfectly normal. We were all gathered around the campfire after dinner, passing around a bottle of whiskey, telling the same old stories we always tell, but still laughing like it was the first time. The fire was crackling, keeping the October chill at bay. It must have been around 10:30 when I decided to call it a night. I'd had a couple drinks, was getting tired, and my tent was set up a bit away from everyone else's, about 100 yards down a little path through the trees. I like my privacy and don't mind the short walk. I'm turning in, guys, I announced, getting up and dusting off my jeans. These old bones need some rest if we're doing that hike tomorrow. Night, Margaret, several voices called out. My friends Jim and Carla offered to walk me back, but I waved them off. I've got my bodyguards, I said, clipping leashes onto Pepper and Max's collars. They were already at my feet, eager as always. Both are Jack Russell mixes, not big dogs by any means, but they've always been alert and protective, especially Max, who thinks he's a Rottweiler trapped in a 15-pound body. I grabbed my flashlight and headed down the path away from the laughter and warmth of the campfire. The night was clear but moonless, making the forest incredibly dark beyond my light beam. The temperature had dropped and I could see my breath. My tent was in a small clearing near a stream. The babbling water had seemed so peaceful when I'd set up, but now the sound just made it harder to hear what was around me. I was about halfway to my tent when I heard it. Leaves crunching off to my right, beyond where my flashlight reached. Not unusual in the woods at night could be anything, but it made me pause. Both dogs froze too, which was the first thing that struck me as odd. Normally, they'd be barking their heads off at a squirrel, let alone something big enough to make that noise. I swept my flashlight toward the sound, but before I could focus on anything, something moved. No. Not moved. It ran across the path about 20 feet ahead of me. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing at first. It was upright like a person, but much bigger than any of my friends. It crossed the entire clearing in just 2 or 3 strides, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for its size. I stood there, completely frozen. My flashlight beam trembled where I'd caught just the back of whatever it was, disappearing into the thick brush near the stream. It was dark, covered in what looked like hair or fur, and moved with a strange rolling gait that was somehow both awkward and incredibly efficient. Both dogs were pressed against my legs, completely silent. Max, who barks if a leaf falls wrong, was dead quiet, trembling against me. That scared me more than anything. I don't know how long I stood there. Probably only 30 seconds, though it felt like forever. My mind was racing. Everyone I knew was back at the fire. None of my aging friends could move that quickly, and this thing was much larger than any of them. After my initial shock wore off, I spun around and hurried back toward the campfire, trying not to run and fall in the dark. The dogs stayed right with me, no pulling on their leashes like usual. When I reached the group, I must have looked as scared as I felt. "Whoa, Margaret, you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost," Dave said, noticing me first. I tried to steady my voice. I saw something out there, something big. It ran across the path in front of me. "What, like a deer?" Sarah asked, reaching for her beer. I shook my head firmly. "No, it was on two legs, moving upright, but bigger than any of us." The reactions were pretty much what you'd expect. Concerned looks, a few exchanged glances, and then Gary, always the practical one, suggested, "Probably just a deer. In the dark with shadows, they can look weird sometimes." "Deer don't walk on two legs," I insisted, "and they don't have arms." That's when the joking started. Someone mentioned Bigfoot, and they all had a good laugh. I wasn't laughing. Neither were my dogs, who were still unusually quiet and vigilant. Finally, Jim and Paul offered to walk me back to my tent. I accepted, feeling slightly foolish but still unnerved. As we walked, they kept their flashlights swinging wide, occasionally making jokes about Sasquatch that were clearly meant to lighten my mood, but just irritated me. When we reached my tent, they looked around half-heartedly. "See, nothing here," Jim said. "Probably just a deer or maybe a black bear. They can look weird when they stand up." "It wasn't a bear," I said, knowing what I'd seen. "It moved too quickly, too purposefully." Paul patted my shoulder. "Well, whatever it was, it's gone now. You good?" I nodded, not wanting to seem like the scared old lady of the group. They left, their flashlight beams bobbing away through the trees, their laughter fading as they rejoined the group. Once they were gone, I quickly unzipped my tent and ushered the dogs inside. Then I did something I've never done while camping before. I opened my locked case and took out my .38 revolver. I've had it for home protection for years and brought it camping just as a precaution against creeps or dangerous animals. I'd never actually felt the need to have it loaded and ready, but that night I did. I kept it right next to my pillow. The dogs weren't acting normal at all. Usually when we camp, they're alert to every sound, occasionally growling or giving a warning bark at raccoons or other nighttime visitors. That night, they curled up against me in my sleeping bag and stayed completely silent. But they weren't relaxed. Their bodies were tense, ears constantly shifting. I didn't sleep. How could I? Every sound from outside had me on edge. The stream that had seemed so peaceful now masked other noises, making me strain to hear. Around midnight, maybe a bit later, I heard it. Soft footfalls near the stream, something heavy but careful. There was a pattern to it that no four-legged animal would make. The dogs heard it too. Max raised his head, his eyes reflecting the faint light from my electric lantern, but he didn't make a sound. Pepper burrowed deeper against me. I clutched the revolver, my heart pounding so loud I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. The footsteps moved around, never coming too close to the tent, but never leaving the area either. It was like something was patrolling, or maybe just curious. At one point, I swear I heard heavy breathing, not animal panting, but deep, controlled breaths. I lay there rigid, wondering if I should wake the entire campground with a gunshot, but afraid of what might happen if I did. Eventually, as the first hint of dawn lightened the sky, the sounds moved away. I waited another hour before cautiously unzipping the tent and peering out. The morning mist hung over the stream, making everything look otherworldly. The dogs stuck right by me as I grabbed my flashlight, still on from the night before, batteries now weak, and stepped outside. I scanned the area near where I'd heard the footsteps. The ground was covered with pine needles and fallen leaves, making it hard to see any clear prints. Near the stream bank, though, I found a spot where something heavy had clearly crushed the undergrowth. The ferns and small plants were flattened in a way that seemed deliberate, not like a deer had bedded down. What really got me was finding a small pile of rocks stacked near that spot. 3 rocks placed one on top of another. It might sound silly, but I've been camping my whole life and know that doesn't happen naturally. Someone or something had placed them there. I quickly packed up my tent, not even bothering with breakfast. The dogs seemed as eager to leave as I was. When the rest of the group started stirring, I was already loaded up. They noticed my hurry, but didn't comment much beyond a few more jokes about my Bigfoot encounter. Before we left the park that day, I stopped by the ranger station, trying to sound casual when I asked if there had been any unusual sightings or reports in the area. The younger ranger shrugged it off, but the older one, probably in his 60s, gave me a long look. "What kind of unusual are we talking about?" he asked carefully. I hesitated, not wanting to sound crazy. Just anything out of the ordinary. Any wildlife that might walk on two legs or be unusually large. He glanced at his younger colleague, who had walked away to help another visitor, then leaned closer across the counter. "We get stories sometimes. Tall shadows in the woods, especially near water. The island folks don't talk about it much with tourists, but there are whispers about large shapes that take fish from campsites, things that knock on cabin walls at night." I felt a chill run through me. "Have you ever seen anything?" He straightened up. "Not personally, but I've worked these woods for 27 years, and I don't dismiss what people report. The island has a lot of remote areas." He paused. "Whatever you think you saw, maybe keep it between us. Some things are better left alone." That was 4 years ago. My friends still tease me about the giant shadow by the creek whenever we plan our camping trips. I've gone back to Moran State Park twice since then, but I always stay in the main campground now, never off by myself. And I don't bring my dogs anymore. That's how badly it affected them. I've spent countless hours researching similar encounters in the Pacific Northwest. I've read about the long history of Sasquatch sightings in the San Juan Islands. Some local Native American traditions speak of stick Indians or other forest beings. I don't know what to believe, but I know what I saw, something big as a barn door and quiet as a whisper, as my grandmother would have said. I've never felt comfortable telling this story widely because I know how it sounds, but I know what I experienced that night. A creature that shouldn't exist according to science, but somehow does. Something that was aware of me, curious about me, but chose to leave me alone. The thing that haunts me most isn't fear anymore. It's the realization that we don't know everything, that the forests still hold secrets. And sometimes those secrets find us. Story 9. I've never told many people about what happened that night. Every time I try, I either chicken out or people look at me like I'm making it up. But I swear on everything I hold dear, what I'm about to tell you is exactly what happened to us in June of 2001. My sister Jen and I were staying with our mom at our Aunt Carol's farmhouse near Spencer, Indiana. It was one of those typical family visits. My aunt had inherited our grandparents' old place, and Mom wanted to help her sort through some stuff in the barn. We figured we'd make a little vacation out of it. My Uncle Dave was there too, and my cousin Megan. The farm was nothing special, just an old 2-story white farmhouse with a wraparound porch, sitting on about 40 acres with some woods behind it. That day had been brutally hot, the kind of Midwest summer heat that sticks to your skin. By evening, the temperature had barely dropped. The humidity was so thick you could practically drink the air. We'd spent most of the day helping clear out old furniture from the barn, and by nightfall, we were all exhausted but too hot to sleep. It was around 10 at night, and we had every window in that old farmhouse wide open, hoping to catch even the smallest breeze. We were all in the living room watching some stupid reality show on TV. Mom and Aunt Carol were sharing the couch. Uncle Dave was half asleep in his recliner, and Jen, Megan, and I were sprawled across the floor with bowls of ice cream, trying to cool off. That's when we heard it. It started as this, I don't even know how to describe it properly. A scream, a howl. It came from the hill behind the house, maybe a quarter-mile away. At first, I thought it might be a coyote, but no, this was different. It was this horrible combination of high-pitched wailing that suddenly dropped into this deep, guttural growl, like nothing I'd ever heard before or since. We all froze. The TV was still going, but nobody was watching anymore. What the hell was that? Uncle Dave sat up straight, suddenly wide awake. Probably just a fox or something, Aunt Carol said, but her voice was shaky. Then we heard it again, but closer this time, much closer. The sound made the hair on my arms stand up. It wasn't a fox. It wasn't a coyote. It wasn't anything I recognized. Mom looked at Aunt Carol. That's not normal. Uncle Dave got up and switched off the TV. Shh, listen. We sat in silence for what felt like forever. The only sounds were the chirping crickets and the occasional creak of the old house settling. Then suddenly, the crickets stopped. Complete silence. Anyone who's spent time in the country knows how unnatural that is. The third scream nearly made me jump out of my skin. It was so close now, maybe just at the edge of the yard. That's when I noticed my Aunt Carol had disappeared from the room. She came back a moment later carrying her shotgun. "Carol, for God's sake," my mom whispered. "Just in case," Aunt Carol replied. Her hands were steady, but her face was pale. Uncle Dave went to the window and tried to peer out into the darkness. "I don't see anything," he said, but the way he said it made it clear he was expecting to see something. I remember looking at my sister Jen. She was 16 then, 2 years older than me, and usually the brave one, but she looked terrified. Megan, my cousin, was only 12 and had started crying silently. We heard heavy footsteps outside, like something large moving around the perimeter of the house. Not the quick steps of a deer or the padding of a dog. These were slow, deliberate steps that seemed to sink into the ground with their weight. "Everyone stay here," Uncle Dave whispered. He started toward the kitchen door, but Aunt Carol grabbed his arm. "Don't you dare go out there, Dave." That's when we heard whatever it was move onto the porch. The old wooden boards creaked under its weight. It was on the far side of the house, near the living room. We all huddled together in the center of the room. The only light was coming from a small lamp in the corner, casting long shadows across the walls. The living room had these big picture windows that looked out onto the porch, covered only by thin white curtains that didn't do much to block the view from either side. And then I saw it. We all did. A massive silhouette moved past the window. All I could make out was its shape against the curtain. But it was huge, at least 7 feet tall, maybe more, wide too, with broad shoulders, and it was definitely walking on 2 legs. My mum pulled me and Jen close to her. I could feel her heart racing. Uncle Dave had moved to stand beside Aunt Carol, who had the shotgun pointed at the window. "If that thing tries to come in," she whispered. We didn't move. We barely breathed. The creature seemed to pause by the window, like it was trying to look inside. I remember thinking that the only thing between us and whatever that thing was were those flimsy curtains and a pane of glass. Then it moved away from the window, continuing along the porch. We heard the heavy footsteps moving toward the front of the house. For a second, I thought maybe it was leaving. That's when it happened. Bang, bang, bang. Something hit the side of the house so hard the walls shook. Picture frames rattled. A glass fell off the side table and shattered on the floor. It wasn't knocking, it was pounding, with enough force that I thought it might break through the wall. Megan started sobbing. Uncle Dave whispered, "Shh, honey, it's okay." But his voice cracked. Bang, 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 again, this time on the front door. 3 distinct, powerful hits. I've never heard anything hit a door that hard. It was like someone was using a battering ram. "What does it want?" Jen whispered, her face buried against Mom's shoulder. Aunt Carol raised the shotgun higher. "Dave," she whispered, "go check." Uncle Dave looked at her like she was crazy. "Are you serious?" "We need to know what we're dealing with," she insisted. Reluctantly, Uncle Dave crept toward the front door. We followed at a distance, staying behind Aunt Carol and her shotgun. The entry hall was dark. Uncle Dave reached for the porch light switch and flipped it on. Through the small window beside the door, we could see part of the porch was now illuminated. There was nothing there. Uncle Dave put his hand on the doorknob. "Dave, don't," my mom pleaded, but he was already turning it. He opened the door just a crack and peered out. "I don't see anything," he whispered. Mom pushed past Aunt Carol and moved beside Uncle Dave. She looked out through the crack in the door. I'll never forget the look on her face. Her eyes went wide, and she stumbled backwards so fast she nearly fell. because right at that moment, whatever was out there moved past the door. Mom later told us all she saw was a massive leg, thick as a tree trunk and covered in dark matted hair, stepping past the narrow opening in the doorway. Uncle Dave slammed the door shut and locked it. At that exact moment, the thing let out another one of those screams, so loud it felt like it was inside the house with us. The sound was right there, just on the other side of the door. We ran back to the living room. Aunt Carol positioned herself with the shotgun aimed at the front door, ready to fire if anything tried to come in. Uncle Dave grabbed the phone to call the police, but the line was dead. This was before everyone had cell phones, and even if we'd had them, reception out there was non-existent. For the next hour, we sat in terrified silence, listening to that thing move around the house. Sometimes it would be quiet for so long I'd think it was gone. Then we'd hear heavy footsteps on the porch again, or branches breaking near the edge of the yard. Around midnight, the sounds seemed to move farther away. By 1 in the morning, we couldn't hear anything anymore. Still, none of us slept. We stayed in the living room, lights on, jumping at every sound until dawn. When the first light came through the windows, Uncle Dave finally ventured outside with the shotgun. The rest of us followed, not wanting to be left alone in the house. The first thing that hit me was the smell. It was this awful, pungent odor, like a skunk that had been burnt. It was strongest around the porch and front door. We found evidence all around the property. There was a path of flattened grass leading from the woods to the house. Several bushes along the side yard had been pushed aside, broken branches everywhere. But the strangest thing was, we couldn't find any clear footprints. The ground was too hard and dry from the heat. Uncle Dave tried to play it off as maybe a bear, but we all knew better. Bears don't walk on 2 legs consistently. They don't stand 7 feet tall. They don't pound on houses or scream like that. When we went back inside, Aunt Carol refused to talk about what happened. She put her shotgun away and started making breakfast like it was any other morning. But I noticed she kept looking out the windows. Later that day, Mom took us back home early. We were supposed to stay another 3 days, but she made up some excuse about work. On the drive home, she finally spoke about it. "What we saw last night," she started, then paused for a long time. "I don't know what it was, but it wasn't normal." "It was Bigfoot, wasn't it?" Jen asked quietly. Mom didn't answer right away. She just gripped the steering wheel tighter. "I don't know what else it could have been," she finally said. "The size, the way it moved, that smell, everything matches the stories." I remember feeling this weird mix of terror and excitement. We'd experienced something that most people only read about. It's been over 20 years now, and I still think about that night all the time. I've gone back and forth between trying to rationalize it and accepting what I know we all saw. I've researched similar encounters in that area, and there have been others. Owen County has a history of sightings going back decades. Aunt Carol sold the farmhouse 3 years later. She never gave a reason, but I think we all knew why. Uncle Dave passed away in 2011, and he never talked about that night again. My sister Jen refuses to camp or hike anywhere remote now. As for me, I can't explain what happened that night. I can only tell you what I experienced. Something huge, something that walked on 2 legs, something that screamed like nothing I've ever heard before, came to that farmhouse that night. It was powerful enough to make the walls shake. It was intelligent enough to circle the house, to approach the door, to try to look in at us. And sometimes, on hot summer nights when I have the windows open, I find myself listening for that scream again. Mosanji, Story 10. Dudi, I've been debating whether to share this for weeks now. I'm not one for crazy stories or making things up for attention. Ask anyone who knows me. I'm probably the most practical person they know. I've been hiking the Cascade trails for over 7 years, usually solo, and I've never had a problem, until mid-July. It was supposed to be just another day hike on my favorite loop trail near Mount Baker. The weather was perfect, not too hot, around 70 degrees, with a light breeze. I packed light, some trail mix, 2 liters of water, my first aid kit, and bear spray. which I always carry but have never needed to use. I'd done this particular trail at least 15 times before. It's about 8 miles total, moderately difficult in some spots, but nothing crazy. I hit the trail around 9 in the morning. Everything was normal for the first hour or so. I passed a couple of other hikers heading back to the trailhead, exchanged the usual friendly nods. The trail was in good condition, despite some recent rainfall. I remember feeling particularly good that day. My legs felt strong, and I was making better time than usual. Around 10:30, I reached the section where the trail cuts through a denser part of the forest. The pines are taller there, blocking a lot of the sunlight, and the undergrowth gets thicker. I was moving at a steady pace when I first noticed something was off. The forest went completely silent. If you spend a lot of time outdoors, you know what I mean. Usually, there's a constant background of sounds. Birds singing, squirrels rustling in the underbrush, the wind moving through the trees. But suddenly, nothing. It was like someone had hit a mute button on the entire forest. My first thought was, cougar. That's typically what silence means. A predator is nearby and everything else is hiding. I've encountered cougars twice before while hiking, but always at a distance. Still, I wasn't taking chances. I pulled out my bear spray and held it ready, continuing to walk but much more slowly, scanning the trees and undergrowth for any movement. The silence continued for maybe 5 minutes as I moved forward. Then I got that unmistakable feeling of being watched. You know that prickling sensation on the back of your neck? It was intense. I glanced over my shoulder but saw nothing unusual, just trees and the empty trail behind me. I kept walking, moving a bit faster now. The silence was making me increasingly uneasy. There was no wind, no birds, nothing. Just my footsteps on the trail and my own breathing, which was getting more rapid as my anxiety increased. That's when I saw it. About 30 feet ahead on the right side of the trail, something was peeking out from behind a massive Douglas fir. At first, I thought it was another hiker taking a break off trail, but as I focused on it, I realized whatever was looking at me from behind that tree was way too tall to be a normal person. I stopped dead in my tracks. What I was seeing didn't make sense to my brain at first. The creature, and I hesitate to even use that word, but there's no other way to describe it, had only part of its face visible from behind the tree. One eye, part of a forehead, and a bit of the cheek. The eye was dark, almost black, set deep under a prominent brow ridge. The skin around the eye was a dark, brownish color, and there was thick, reddish-brown hair covering the parts of the head I could see. As I stood there, the creature shifted slightly, revealing more of its face. That's when I realized I was looking at something at least 6.5, maybe 7 feet tall. The proportions were all wrong for a human. The head was larger, more conical at the top, and the shoulders that I could partially see were massively broad. In that moment, a word formed in my mind that I never thought I'd seriously apply to anything I'd encounter. Bigfoot, or Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it. I'd always scoffed at those stories, figured they were just bears spotted at weird angles, or people with overactive imaginations. But standing there on that trail, I knew with absolute certainty I wasn't looking at a bear, a moose, or a person in a costume. We made eye contact. Direct eye contact. That's what still haunts me the most. There was undeniable intelligence in that gaze. Not animal intelligence, but something, I don't know how to explain it. Something that understood exactly what I was and was assessing me just as I was assessing it. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Every instinct was screaming at me to run, but I remembered enough about wildlife encounters to know that running was the worst thing I could do. If this was a predator, running would trigger a chase response. So I stood absolutely still. We stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only 15 or 20 seconds. Then, without making a sound, and this still baffles me because something that size should have made noise, it slowly pulled back further behind the tree. It didn't fully disappear. I could still see the edge of a shoulder and a bit of arm covered in the same reddish-brown hair. Taking this as my chance, I started to slowly back away, keeping my eyes fixed on the tree the whole time. I didn't turn my back. Every few steps, I'd glance quickly behind me to make sure I wasn't going to trip over anything, then return my gaze to the tree. The creature didn't move again, at least not that I could see. After I'd put about 50 feet between us, I finally turned around and started walking faster toward the trailhead. I didn't run. I still had enough presence of mind to know that stumbling and injuring myself would be disastrous. But I moved as quickly as I safely could. The whole time, I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind me, but there was nothing, just that unnatural silence that seemed to press in from all sides. I kept looking back over my shoulder every few seconds, convinced I was being followed, but I never saw the creature again. After about 15 minutes of walking quickly, almost jogging at points, I started to hear forest sounds again. First a distant bird call, then the rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was like crossing some invisible boundary back into the normal world. By the time I reached my car, I was drenched in sweat and my legs were shaking. I sat in the driver's seat for a good 10 minutes trying to process what had happened. Had I really seen what I thought I saw? Was my mind playing tricks on me? But I know what I saw. The image of that eye looking at me, the strange proportions of the face, the absolute silence of the forest. It was all too vivid, too detailed to be imagination. I drove home in a daze. I didn't tell anyone at first. I mean, how do you bring that up in conversation? Hey, so I'm pretty sure I saw Bigfoot today. I'd sound crazy. I still worry about sounding crazy even posting this anonymously. It took me 3 days to even tell my boyfriend. He was supportive but skeptical, suggesting maybe it was a bear standing on its hind legs. But bears don't stand perfectly still behind trees and peek out with one eye. They don't have that level of awareness, and they definitely make noise when they move. I've been back out hiking since then, but I've changed my habits. I stick to more open trails now, areas with better visibility and fewer dense sections of forest. I always hike with at least one other person, and I find myself constantly scanning the tree line, jumping at every unexpected sound. The thing that bothers me most isn't the fear, though that was intense. It's the way the encounter has forced me to question things I thought I knew for certain. I was so sure creatures like Bigfoot were myths, stories invented by people who mistook ordinary animals for something extraordinary. Now I don't know what to believe. I've spent hours researching Bigfoot sightings in the Cascade since my encounter. There are more reports than I expected, some from very credible sources. Park rangers, wildlife biologists, people with nothing to gain from making up stories. Many describe exactly what I saw: the silence, the intelligent eyes, the way the creature moves with unexpected stealth for its size. I keep trying to rationalize what happened. Maybe it was a person playing a prank. But who would stand in the middle of a forest on the off chance a solo hiker would come by? And how would they create that unnatural silence? Maybe it was some kind of rare, undocumented primate. But in Washington state, that makes no sense either. The most logical explanation is that I somehow misinterpreted what I saw, that my mind filled in gaps and created something that wasn't really there. But when I close my eyes, I can still see that face with perfect clarity. I can still feel the intensity of that gaze. It wasn't a misinterpretation. It was real. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I'm not even sure I would believe this story if someone else told it to me. But I know what I experienced, and I needed to share it with people who won't immediately dismiss it as the ramblings of someone who spent too much time alone in the woods. Whatever I saw that day in the Cascades, it changed something fundamental in how I see the world. There are things out there we don't understand, things that exist in the spaces between what we know and what we think we know. And sometimes, if you're alone in the forest and the world goes quiet around you, Those things might be watching you from behind a tree, just as curious about you as you are terrified of them. Story 11. I've been debating whether to share this for years. What happened to me back in November of 1981 is something I rarely talk about, even with family. Most people just laugh it off, but I know what I saw that day, and it wasn't human. I was 15 at the time, still too young for a driver's license, but old enough to handle a rifle. I'd been hunting since I was 12, usually with my dad, but that day I went out with my older brother's friends near Edgefield, South Carolina. They were all in their 20s and let me tag along mostly as a favor to my brother who couldn't make it. The morning started like any typical hunting day. We left before sunrise, the truck's headlights cutting through the darkness as we drove down these winding back roads. The air was cold. Frost covered everything, and our breath came out in white clouds. We parked in this small clearing surrounded by pines and oaks. I remember the sound of the truck doors closing seemed so loud in that early morning silence. Mike, the oldest of the group, handed me a thermos of coffee. "Drink up, Danny," he said. "Going to be a cold one today." The coffee burned my throat but warmed me up inside. My hands were already starting to get numb despite my gloves. After checking our gear, we hiked about a mile into the woods. Everyone was talking in whispers about where to set up. I was nervous because this was my first time hunting without someone directly supervising me. Mike pointed deeper into the forest. "Daniel, we spotted some fresh deer sign yesterday down by the creek bottom, about 300 yards that way," he said, pointing. "Good spot for you. Just follow that game trail and you'll see where the creek bends. Set up near that big oak we showed you on the map." I nodded, trying to look confident though my stomach was doing flips. I'd never been completely alone in these woods before. They handed me a small walkie-talkie in case of emergency, but the reception was spotty at best. "We'll be spread out in that direction," Mike said, pointing to the west. "Meet back at the truck at 2 o'clock. Don't get lost." I headed off alone, my rifle slung over my shoulder while they went their separate ways. The moon was still out, casting enough light that I could navigate without my flashlight most of the time. I only switched it on when the trail got too dark under the thick canopy. About halfway to my spot, I crossed this narrow field, and that's when I first felt it. This uncomfortable sensation crawling up my spine like I was being watched. I stopped, listening. The woods were quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I swept my flashlight across the tree line but saw nothing unusual. "Just nerves," I mumbled to myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I reached the creek bottom just as the sky was beginning to lighten. The big oak was right where they said it would be, its massive trunk providing perfect cover. I settled in, back against the rough bark, rifle across my lap. I switched off my flashlight and let my eyes adjust to the dim light. The creek gurgled softly nearby, and frost crunched under my boots whenever I shifted position. Time passed slowly. I watched the sun rise, gradually illuminating the forest floor. Birds started calling, and a few squirrels scampered around. I stayed perfectly still, just like my dad had taught me. Around 9 o'clock, I spotted movement on a low rise about 80 yards away. My heart immediately started pounding when I saw it was a good-sized buck, probably an 8-pointer. He was beautiful, head up, alert, his breath visible in the cold air. I slowly raised my rifle, trying not to make any sudden movements. Before I could get him in my sights, the deer's head jerked up, his ears flicked forward, and then he bolted, white tail flashing as he disappeared into the underbrush. Something had spooked him, but I hadn't made a sound. That's when I heard it, this heavy breathing behind me. At first it was soft, but it grew louder, like bellows drawing air through massive lungs. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I froze, too scared to move. The breathing continued, getting closer. I could feel the warmth of it on the back of my neck now. Slowly, I turned my head to look at my shadow cast by the morning sun. I saw my outline against the ground, the tree's shadow next to mine, and then another shadow towering over both. I jumped up and spun around, nearly dropping my rifle. What I saw standing there, not more than 5 feet away, is burned into my memory forever. It was huge. That's the first thing that hit me, just how massive this thing was. It stood at least 2 feet taller than me, and I was 5'10" at the time. Its shoulders were incredibly broad, with a chest like a barrel. But it wasn't a bear. Not even close. The creature was covered in this reddish-brown hair that looked like pine straw, long enough that it formed clumps over its shoulders and down its arms. Its face, though, God, its face had no hair at all. Just this dark grey skin that looked leathery. It had a flat, wide nose and a mouth that seemed too wide for its face. But the eyes are what still haunt me. They were deeply sunken and so black, they didn't reflect any light at all. Just these 2 black pits staring right at me. Its arms hung unusually low, with hands that dangled near its knees. The fingers were long, too long, and ended in what looked like short, thick claws. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It was like my body had completely shut down from fear. The thing tilted its head slightly, studying me, and then it made this sound, not quite a growl, more like a deep rumbling huffing noise that I felt in my chest. That sound broke my paralysis. I dropped my rifle, turned, and ran. I just ran. I didn't think about direction or where I was going. Pure panic took over. I was screaming, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping my face, thorns tearing at my clothes. I don't even remember how long I ran for, but eventually I heard voices calling my name. I stumbled into Mike and the others, who were rushing toward the sound of my screams. I was hyperventilating, covered in scratches, my pants torn at the knee where I'd fallen. I couldn't form coherent sentences at first, just kept pointing back the way I'd come and gasping about something in the woods. "Whoa, slow down, kid," Mike said, gripping my shoulders. "What happened? Bear? Coyote?" When I finally managed to explain what I'd seen, they exchanged looks. One of them snickered. "Bigfoot, huh?" Keith said, not even trying to hide his smirk. "You sure you didn't just see a shadow or something?" I was furious. I knew what I'd seen. "Go look for yourselves," I shouted. "My rifle's still back there." Mike sighed. "Fine. We need to get your gun anyway. Can't leave a rifle in the woods." We walked back, me trailing behind them, jumping at every sound. When we reached the oak tree, my rifle was right where I'd dropped it. But what shut them up real quick were the tracks. There in the frost and leaves were these enormous footprints. Each one had 3 wide toes and measured about 16 inches long and nearly 5 inches across. They weren't bear tracks. They weren't human tracks. They weren't anything I'd ever seen before. The guys went quiet, their faces suddenly serious. Mike knelt down to examine one of the prints. "What the hell made these?" Keith whispered, all traces of amusement gone. We followed the tracks for about 70 yards to where the creek bank dropped off steeply. More prints were visible in the wet sand below, pointing across the bottomland toward the denser part of the forest. No one suggested following them further. The ride back was mostly silent. Mike tried to rationalize what we'd seen. Maybe it was some kind of deformed bear, he suggested, or possibly someone playing a prank with fake feet. But I could tell none of them believed that. They'd seen those tracks. For years after, I avoided talking about what happened. People in small South Carolina towns aren't exactly open to stories about Bigfoot encounters. I'd get laughed out of every hunting camp in the county. But then, about 5 years later, I heard about 2 teenagers who'd been camping near the Savannah River, not far from where my encounter happened. They reported seeing a huge, dark creature at the edge of a soybean field, as tall as a man on a ladder, before it disappeared into the riverwoods. That's when it clicked for me. These waterways, the creeks, rivers, and swamps, they all connect throughout South Carolina. They're like highways for these creatures, allowing them to move without being seen. That's why sightings are so rare and scattered. They use the water to hide their movements and stay away from people. I never went back to that particular hunting spot. Couldn't bring myself to. I still hunt, but I'm always aware of my surroundings in a way I wasn't before. I pay attention to sounds, to that feeling of being watched, and I never, ever hunt alone anymore. Some nights I still wake up in a cold sweat, those black eyes vivid in my mind. I can still hear that deep huffing breath. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't run. Would it have attacked me? Was it just curious? I'll never know. What I do know is that there are things in those woods that science hasn't explained yet. Call it Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever. I know what I saw that day wasn't human, and it's still out there, somewhere in the waterways of South Carolina, watching and waiting. I've kept this to myself for too long. Maybe someone else has seen something similar. Maybe I'm not alone in this. All I know is that what happened that November morning was real, and no amount of rational explanation will ever convince me otherwise. Story 12. I still get goosebumps thinking about what happened at that lake back in 2005. It's been nearly 18 years, but some nights I still wake up in a cold sweat, thinking I hear that sound again. My buddy Mark and I were 16 that summer. We'd been planning this camping trip for weeks, just us, no adults, deep in Conecuh National Forest in southern Alabama. We'd camped before, but always at designated campgrounds with other people around. This was our first real wilderness trip, and man, were we pumped. We told our parents we were going to one of the regular camping areas, but we actually had our sights set on this small, unnamed lake we'd heard about from Mark's older brother. It wasn't on any of the tourist maps, and you had to hike about 2 miles off the main trail to reach it. Perfect for 2 teenagers looking for adventure, right? We packed light. Just a small 2-person tent, sleeping bags, fishing gear, and enough food for the weekend. It was late June, hot as hell during the day, but we knew it would cool down at night. The hike in was brutal with all our gear. By the time we reached the lake around 3 in the afternoon, we were drenched in sweat, and our shoulders were killing us from our overstuffed backpacks. But man, that lake was worth it. Crystal clear water surrounded by dense pine forest, with a small clearing right at the edge that looked perfect for our tent. Not another soul around for miles. We high-fived, dropped our packs, and just stood there for a minute, taking it all in. The only sounds were birds, the light breeze through the trees, and water lapping at the shore. "Dude, we actually found it," Mark said, grinning like an idiot. I remember feeling like we'd discovered our own private paradise. We set up camp quickly, pitched the tent, gathered some wood for a fire later, and hung our food bag from a tree branch about 30 yards from our site. Mark's dad had drilled that into us. Keep your food away from where you sleep to avoid attracting animals. We weren't worried about bears in this part of Alabama, but raccoons and other critters could still cause problems. With camp sorted, we grabbed our fishing rods and headed to the water. The lake wasn't very big, maybe a 1/4 mile across, surrounded by hills covered in thick forest. We waded in a bit and started casting. Within an hour, Mark had caught a decent-sized bass. Nothing huge, but definitely enough for dinner. We were stoked. As the sun started going down, we cleaned the fish by the lake edge, put it on a stringer, and left it in the shallow water to keep cool while we got our fire going. I remember looking around as I was building the fire ring with some rocks from the shore, feeling like we were the only people for miles. There was this weird moment where the forest suddenly went quiet. No birds, no insects, nothing. It only lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it was noticeable enough that we both commented on it. Probably just a hawk flying over or something, Mark said, and I agreed. But looking back now, I wonder if that was the first sign. We cooked the fish over the fire, along with some instant mashed potatoes we'd brought. Man, nothing tastes better than fresh fish when you're starving after hiking. We sat around the fire for a while after eating, talking about school, girls, and all the usual stuff 16-year-old guys talk about. I remember feeling so grown up, out there on our own. By 10 o'clock, we were beat. The temperature had dropped quite a bit, and we decided to turn in. We made sure the fire was completely out, brushed our teeth at the lake edge, and crawled into our sleeping bags inside the tent. I remember checking that our flashlights were within reach before zipping the tent closed. I dozed off pretty quickly, but I'm not sure how long I was asleep before I heard it. This sound, I still can't describe it perfectly. It started as a long, deep whoop that seemed to come from the hill above the lake, maybe a quarter-mile away. Then it changed to 3 or 4 quick whoops in succession. It echoed across the water, bouncing back from the opposite shore. I've never heard anything like it before or since. It wasn't an owl, wasn't a coyote or wolf, definitely wasn't a person. It was loud as hell and had this, I don't know, power behind it. I sat bolt upright in my sleeping bag. "Mark," I whispered, shaking him. "You hear that?" He was already awake, eyes wide in the darkness. "What the fuck is that?" he whispered back. We both froze, listening. The call came again, same pattern, one long whoop, then several shorter ones. But this time it was closer, maybe from the edge of the forest near our clearing. "Probably just some weird bird," I said, trying to convince myself more than Mark. "That's no bird, man," Mark replied, and I could hear the tension in his voice. We sat there in silence for what felt like forever, but was probably only a minute or two. Then we heard it again. And this time it was so close and so loud, it felt like the tent walls were vibrating. It had to be right at the edge of our clearing, no more than 30 feet from our tent. Then came the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, moving along the perimeter of our clearing. Whatever it was big, and it was walking on 2 legs. The footsteps were slow, methodical, like it was taking its time, circling our camp. "Holy shit," Mark breathed. His hand found my arm and gripped it hard. I was too terrified to speak. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. We'd been told all our lives that there weren't any dangerous predators in this part of Alabama. No bears, no cougars. But something big was out there, and it was on 2 feet. The footsteps stopped directly in front of our tent, the side facing the lake. Then came a sound that still haunts me, deep, powerful sniffing, like something was scenting the air. Not quick little sniffs like a dog, but long, deliberate inhalations. Whatever it was, its head had to be at least 6 feet off the ground, based on where the sound was coming from. Mark and I were frozen in our sleeping bags. I remember thinking about the flashlights, wondering if I should grab one, but I was too scared to move. My body was rigid with fear, and I could feel sweat running down my back despite the cool night air. The sniffing continued for maybe 30 seconds. Then the footsteps started again, moving toward the lake. We heard splashing, not like something drinking, but bigger movements in the water. Then more footsteps, moving away from the lake and along the edge of our clearing again. This went on for what felt like hours, but was probably about 20 minutes. The thing circling our camp, occasionally making those whooping calls, sometimes stopping to sniff the air. It never approached the tent directly again, but it didn't leave either. It was like it was patrolling, keeping us contained. Eventually, the footsteps and sounds moved further away, back up the hill where we'd first heard the call. The last whoop we heard that night was distant, like it was saying goodbye. Neither of us slept a wink after that. We lay there in silence, too afraid to talk, too afraid to move, just listening to the night. I remember checking my watch around 4 in the morning and seeing that we still had hours until daylight. It was the longest night of my life. As soon as the first grey light of dawn filtered through the tent walls, Mark whispered, "We're getting the hell out of here, right?" "Absolutely," I replied, but neither of us made a move to exit the tent until the sun was fully up. When we finally mustered the courage to unzip the tent and step outside, the clearing looked normal at first glance. No massive footprints, no obvious signs of the visitor from the night before. But then we noticed the changes. Our can of lighter fluid, which we'd left by the fire ring, now had a small pile of rocks neatly stacked on top of it, not haphazardly placed, but deliberately arranged in a pyramid, with the smallest rock on top. There's no way that could have happened naturally. And when we went down to the lake to check on our fish, the bass we'd caught and left on the stringer in the shallow water, it was gone. The stringer was still there, the cord still tied to the same tree branch where we'd secured it, but the fish had been removed, no signs of it being torn off or eaten. Whatever took it had carefully removed it from the stringer. Raccoon? Mark suggested weakly, but we both knew better. A raccoon or other small animal would have left signs, torn the fish, maybe dragged the stringer. This was clean, deliberate. That's when it hit me. Whatever had visited us during the night wasn't just some animal. It had intelligence. It had examined our camp. It had taken our fish as, what, a trophy, payment, and it had left that stack of rocks as a message. We didn't say much as we packed up camp. We were both on edge, constantly scanning the tree line, jumping at every sound. We skipped breakfast, just wolfed down some granola bars as we stuffed our sleeping bags into their sacks. Should we report this to someone? Mark asked as we shouldered our packs. And say what? That Bigfoot stole our fish? I replied. Even saying it out loud felt ridiculous, but deep down I knew that's exactly what had happened. Nothing else made sense. The hike out was a blur. We practically ran the whole way, not stopping to rest, not even talking much. Every snapping twig or rustling bush made us pick up the pace. I don't think I took a full breath until we reached the main trail again. We never told anyone the full story. Who would believe two teenagers claiming they had a Bigfoot encounter? We told our parents the fishing was bad and the mosquitoes were worse, so we decided to come home early. But Mark and I knew what happened. We talked about it for weeks afterward, going over every detail, every sound. We researched Bigfoot sightings in Alabama and found a few reports from Conecuh National Forest over the years. Nothing recent, but enough to make us believe we weren't crazy. That was 18 years ago, and I've never been back to that lake. Mark and I drifted apart after high school, but we still text each other every June 25th, the anniversary of that night. Just a simple message. Remember the lake. That's all we need to say. I still go camping, still love the outdoors, but I always make sure there are other people nearby now. And when I'm lying in my tent at night and the woods go quiet, I find myself holding my breath, listening for that distinctive whoop echoing across the darkness. Story 13. I still have a hard time talking about what happened that day. Part of me thinks nobody will believe me anyway, but I need to get this off my chest. Maybe someone else has seen something similar and can help make sense of it. This happened in the summer of 2019. I was driving down Jackson Hollow Road near Thornhill, Tennessee. It's this winding road that cuts through some pretty dense forest. Beautiful during the day, but it can feel isolated. I'm a big guy, 6'5", and I've spent plenty of time outdoors, so I'm not someone who gets spooked easily. I was heading to meet some friends at the community theater around 6:30 in the evening. The sun was still up, but it was getting lower, casting these long shadows across the road. I remember it was warm, but not too hot, one of those perfect summer evenings. I was coming up to this sharp curve, one of those that has the yellow warning signs telling you to slow down to 20 miles per hour. I'd driven this road dozens of times, so I knew to take it easy around that bend. As I approached, I noticed something weird in the middle of the road, a grocery bag with what looked like a cereal box spilling out of it. There was something else sticking out of the box, looked like a short log or thick stick jammed inside. It struck me as odd right away. Who leaves a perfectly good box of cereal in the middle of a rural road? And why was there a stick shoved in it? I slowed down more than usual and swerved to avoid running over it. I didn't want to damage my tires if there was something sharp hidden in there. As I passed by, I glanced in my rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it. There was movement where the bag had been, a large, dark shape crouching down by the roadside. My first thought was bear, but immediately I knew that wasn't right. It didn't move like a bear. It was staying low to the ground, but it was wide and solid looking. I can't really explain it, but something about the way it moved just felt different, wrong somehow. I'm not the type to go looking for trouble, but curiosity got the better of me. About 100 yards past the curve, there was a small gravel pullout. I turned my truck around to get a better look. I told myself I'd just drive by slowly and observe from the safety of my vehicle. When I got back to the spot, the bag was completely gone. Not just moved to the side of the road, vanished. There was no trace it had ever been there. I felt a chill despite the warm evening. Something had removed that bag in the 30 seconds it took me to turn around. I drove slowly around the curve, scanning the roadside. About 50 yards ahead, at the edge where the brush line meets the road, I saw something that I still have trouble describing. There was a figure walking away from the road on two legs. It was black, covered in short, thick fur, and had these massive, hunched shoulders. Its arms looked strange, longer than they should be, moving in a way that wasn't quite human. The thing was tall, at least as tall as me, and I'm not a short guy. It moved with this effortless gait, like a very large man walking away, but something was off about it. It took a big step up a small embankment and disappeared into the tall vegetation. I stopped my truck and sat there for a moment, trying to process what I was seeing. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Part of me said to drive away fast, but another part, the stupid part, was fascinated. Before I could think better of it, I jumped out of my truck. I stood on the road looking toward where it had vanished, but couldn't see anything through the thick brush. The woods were silent. No birds, no insects, nothing, just dead quiet. I stood there for maybe a minute, listening, but all I could hear was my own breathing and the occasional car passing on a distant highway. I'm not ashamed to admit that fear won out. Whatever that thing was, I wasn't about to follow it into dense underbrush where I'd be at a disadvantage. I got back in my truck, locked the doors, and just sat there for a while, trying to calm down and make sense of what I'd seen. My mind was a mix of nervousness, confusion, and if I'm honest, a weird kind of excitement. You hear stories about strange things in the woods, but you never expect to actually see something yourself. What bothered me most was the grocery bag with the cereal box. The more I thought about it, the more deliberate it seemed. It was placed perfectly in the middle of that curve, where any driver would have to slow down or stop. Like bait, like it was trying to make me stop my vehicle. The realization made my skin crawl. Had it placed that bag there on purpose? Was it intelligent enough to set up a situation where drivers would stop? And what would have happened if I'd gotten out to move the bag instead of just driving around it? I sat in my truck for about 15 minutes, the engine running, trying to decide what to do. I thought about calling the police, but what would I tell them? That I saw a weird grocery bag and then a large hairy creature that walked like a man but wasn't a man? They'd think I was drunk or on drugs. I finally got myself together enough to continue driving to meet my friends. I was late, and they could tell something was off about me. I made up some excuse about nearly hitting a deer. I wasn't ready to talk about what I'd seen. I'm still not sure I am. For weeks afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I went online and started researching. The description matched what people call Bigfoot, the height, the fur, the way it moved. I'd always thought Bigfoot stories were just tall tales, people mistaking bears or creating hoaxes. Now I'm not so sure. The grocery bag is what really sticks with me. Bears don't set traps. They don't use bait to make cars stop. That takes planning, intelligence. The thought that this creature might have been trying to lure me or someone else out of their vehicle makes my blood run cold. I avoided that road completely for about 6 months, especially at night. Eventually, I started driving it again during daylight hours, but I never stop anywhere near that curve. I keep my doors locked, windows up, and I drive a little faster than I probably should. I've been back to those woods since then, during the day, with friends, never alone. I've seen some large tracks a few times, wider than my hand and deeper than what a person my size would leave. Once I found a tree with bark stripped off about 8 feet up. but I've never seen the creature again, and for that, I'm grateful. I still drive that stretch of Jackson Hollow Road occasionally. Every time I approach that curve, my hands get sweaty on the steering wheel, and I can't help scanning the tree line. Sometimes I think I see movement in my peripheral vision, but when I look directly, there's nothing there. I don't know what I saw that day. Logic tells me there must be some rational explanation, but I can't think of what it could be. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a person in a costume, and it moved with too much purpose to be any normal animal. What keeps me up at night isn't just what I saw, but what almost happened. If I had stopped to move that bag, if I had gotten out of my truck at that exact spot instead of driving past first, I don't want to think about it. I haven't told many people this story. Most would think I'm making it up or that I was confused about what I saw. Maybe I was. Maybe there's a perfectly normal explanation that my brain just couldn't process in the moment. But I know what I saw, and I know that whatever it was deliberate in its actions. So if you're ever driving on Jackson Hollow Road near Thornhill, especially as the sun is getting low, keep your eyes open. And if you see a grocery bag or anything else strange in the middle of the road, don't stop. Just drive around it and keep going. Whatever's watching from the woods might be waiting for you to make that mistake. Story 14. I've never told this story to many people. Most think I'm making it up or exaggerating, but I swear on everything I care about that what I'm about to share is exactly what happened to me when I was 12 years old. This experience has stayed with me for over 50 years now, and I still get goosebumps thinking about it. It was August of 1972. I remember because school was starting in a couple weeks, and we were trying to squeeze every drop out of summer vacation. Me, my little brother Jeremy, he was 10, and our friend David Chen decided to go exploring in the hills around Lemon Valley, Nevada, where we lived. We knew those hills like the backs of our hands, or at least we thought we did. We'd spent practically every summer since I could remember catching lizards, hunting for arrowheads, and finding cool stuff in the old trash dumps from the 1800s. That day was hot as hell, probably in the mid-90s, but we didn't care. We had our canteens filled with water and peanut butter sandwiches wrapped in wax paper that my mom had made us. I remember the sun beating down on my neck, already turning red despite the baseball cap I was wearing. Jeremy had forgotten his hat, so I kept telling him to stay in the shadows when we could find them. We decided to venture further out than usual that day. There was this large, dry wash we'd seen from a distance, but never actually explored. It was maybe 2 miles from our usual spots, and we figured it might have some good arrowheads, since it was near what my dad had told us was an old Native American trail. It took us about an hour to get there, scrambling over rocks and pushing through scrubby bushes. My jeans were already torn at the knee from catching on a cactus. When we finally reached the wash, it was bigger than I expected. About 15 feet deep and 30 feet across at points. The sides were steep but not vertical, with that hard-packed desert dirt that crumbles when you step on it. As we approached the edge, I noticed something right away that got me excited. There was a patch of ground near the wash's edge that had jasper and obsidian chips scattered around. Exactly the kind of place where you might find arrowheads. Dad had taught us that these were the leftovers from when arrowheads were made, so finished ones might be nearby. Guys, check this out, I called to Jeremy and David, who were a little behind me. They ran up, and we all dropped to our knees, carefully sifting through the dirt and rocks, looking for anything man-made. I don't know how much time passed, maybe 15 minutes? I was completely focused on the ground, moving inch by inch across the area. I had found a small piece that might have been the tip of something when this feeling came over me. I can't really describe it except to say that something in my brain suddenly screamed that I wasn't alone. It wasn't a sound I heard. It was like my entire body just knew something was wrong. I slowly raised my head and turned around, and there it was, standing completely still, about 35 feet away, was the largest person I had ever seen. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. It was facing me directly, arms hanging loosely at its sides. The thing was massive, at least 8.5 feet tall. Its shoulders were impossibly wide, maybe 4 feet across, which made its body look strange, because its waist was narrower than you'd expect, with shoulders that size. For a split second, I thought it was a man in a black ski suit. That's what my brain wanted it to be. But then I realized what I was seeing wasn't clothing. It was covered in dark fur. The arms were so long they reached nearly to its knees. I remember thinking that detail was important somehow, like my brain was desperately trying to catalog everything I was seeing. The weirdest part was how it stood there. It wasn't hunched or slouching like you see in those blurry photos. It stood with this dignity. Shoulders back, head high. It looked powerful and, I don't know, regal? That sounds stupid, but that's what comes to mind. I couldn't move. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I couldn't even call out to Jeremy and David, who were still looking at the ground a few feet away from me. I just stared, and it stared back. Its face was dark, with deep-set eyes under a heavy brow ridge. I couldn't make out its features clearly at that distance, but I could feel it watching me. Not aggressively, not like a predator, more like curiosity, or maybe recognition. I don't know. The standoff lasted maybe 45 seconds, but it felt like forever. Then it broke eye contact. It just turned slightly away, and with one long stride, stepped down into the wash and walked off. That movement finally broke my paralysis. "Did you see that?" I whispered, still afraid to speak at full volume. Jeremy and David looked up confused. "See what?" Jeremy asked. That thing, it was right there," I pointed, my hand shaking. They hadn't seen it. They'd been focused on the ground the whole time, but they could tell from my face that something had happened. I was pale and sweating, and my voice was shaking. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but my descriptions came out jumbled. A giant man, but not a man, covered in black fur, arms down to its knees. David laughed nervously. "You're making that up." "I'm not," I insisted. It was right there, staring at me. Jeremy, who always looked up to me, seemed worried. "You really saw something?" I nodded. My hands wouldn't stop trembling. We argued about it for a few minutes. Then David, trying to prove me wrong, suggested we go down into the wash to look for tracks or evidence. I didn't want to, but I also didn't want them thinking I was a liar or a coward. So we climbed down the crumbly embankment into the wash. The bottom was sandy with some rocks and dried vegetation scattered around. We walked in the direction where the figure had gone, me constantly looking around, terrified we'd encounter it again. We didn't find any obvious footprints. The ground was too hard and rocky in most places. But about 200 yards down the wash, we found something that made my skin crawl. There was a section where someone or something had pressed tumbleweed and sticker bush into the dirt wall of the wash, forming a half-oval shape. Matching vegetation had been arranged on the ground beneath it. It wasn't random, it was clearly deliberate. The space created would have perfectly fit that figure if it had been sitting cross-legged with its back against the wall. It was a seat or a shelter, something made by intelligence, not chance. David and Jeremy finally started to believe me. We stood there looking at this crude seat, and the reality of what I'd seen began to sink in for all of us. "We need to go," I said, suddenly aware of how far we were from home, how isolated. We practically ran back up the embankment and headed home, constantly looking over our shoulders. We made it back in record time, our planned day of exploration cut short. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing those eyes, that massive figure standing so still. I tried telling my parents, but they assumed I was making up stories. "A big black hobo," my dad said dismissively. "You boys shouldn't go out that far anyway." The thing is, I'd never heard of Bigfoot back then. This was 1972 in rural Nevada. We didn't have internet or cable TV. I wasn't influenced by movies or stories. I just saw what I saw. It was years later when I first came across a book about Bigfoot sightings, and the descriptions matched what I'd seen. The height, the proportions, the way it moved. It all fit. But by then, I'd mostly convinced myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light, or maybe a very tall man. But deep down, I know what I saw that day. It wasn't human. It was something man-like, but definitely not a man. What haunts me most isn't fear. The creature never threatened us or acted aggressively. What haunts me is the intelligence I saw in those eyes, the deliberate way it had created that seat in the wash. It made me realize that there are things out there we don't understand, things that exist in the margins of our world. We never went back to that wash. School started, life moved on. Jeremy and David eventually stopped talking about it, and I learned not to bring it up because nobody believed me anyway. But sometimes, when I'm out hiking and I get that prickly feeling on the back of my neck, I wonder if I'm being watched again. I wonder if it's out there, observing us from the shadows while we remain oblivious. Just like Jeremy and David were that day. I've spent 50 years trying to explain what I saw. Was it a Bigfoot? A previously undiscovered species? Some kind of wilderness hermit? I don't know. But whatever it was real, it was intelligent, and for those 45 seconds, it decided to let me see it. Why it chose to reveal itself to me that day, I'll never know. But I'm certain it was a deliberate choice. It could have easily stayed hidden. We never would have noticed it. Instead, it stood there letting me take in every detail before calmly walking away. That's my story, believe it or don't. But I know what I saw that August day in 1972, and it's stayed with me ever since. Story 15. I've never really told the full story to anyone outside my family and a couple close friends. It's the kind of thing people either believe or they don't, and honestly, I got tired of the sideways looks and nervous laughs. But after what happened in Allsea a few weeks back, I feel like I need to get this off my chest. It was January 28th, 2000, and we'd been hit with this monster snowstorm that blanketed the hills around Allsea, Oregon. I was cleaning out my garage when my cousin Dale called. Dale works for the Forest Service and usually doesn't call unless it's important. "You're not gonna believe what I just heard," he said, sounding shaken. I could tell something was up because Dale's not the type to get rattled easily. He told me about this guy, Jim Hawkins, who lives in this little cabin on the edge of the timber tract about 15 miles outside town. According to Dale, Jim had called the sheriff's department that morning with a crazy story. The night before, around 10:30, Jim heard something on his porch. Now Jim's place is isolated, like no neighbors for miles isolated. He grabbed his SKS rifle, he's kind of a paranoid type, always talking about being prepared, and went to check. What he saw apparently made him fire without thinking. There were 3 large, hairy, man-like creatures on his porch. Jim said they were trying to get into his storage box where he keeps his game meat. When he fired, he hit one of them. The creature fell into the snow, but it didn't stay down. The other 2 came from the tree line, picked up the injured one, and carried it back into the timber. The weirdest part? Jim said they didn't make a single sound, not one. No screams, no calls, nothing. I laughed it off at first. Dale, come on. Jim's probably been drinking again. But Dale wasn't laughing. They sent people out there, Mark, federal guys. They took blood and hair samples from the porch steps and the snow where it fell. They were wearing suits, taking photographs, the whole 9 yards. That's when I felt the first real chill. The feds don't show up for bear sightings or someone's drunken imagination. Dale went on to tell me that some of the tree planting crews were refusing to go back to the ridge near Jim's place until someone checked the area for more creatures. These were tough guys who worked in all kinds of weather and rough terrain, not easily spooked. I spent the next few days trying to ignore the story, but it kept nagging at me. Then 3 days later, I was driving home and had my police scanner on. Old habit from when I was a volunteer firefighter. I heard 2 local game wardens talking about responding to a possible Sasquatch sighting in the same area. They weren't joking around. They were discussing approach protocols and whether to bring tranquilizer guns. When the snow finally melted in mid-February, The logging crews went back to work in the lower cuts, but I noticed they avoided the farthest blocks for a good while. Nobody would say why, but everyone knew. That's when the memories from '83 started coming back. I'd pushed them down for so long, convinced myself I'd just seen a bear or my eyes were playing tricks. But after hearing about Jim's encounter, I couldn't deny it anymore. It was July of '83. I was 26 and working as a timber truck driver near Deadwood. The money was good and I enjoyed the solitude. That particular day was hot, must have been in the 90s, and I was making my last run before heading home. I remember everything about that day with a clarity that still unnerves me. The air smelled like cedar and warm dust. There was barely any wind, just that heavy summer stillness where you can hear every snap of a twig for what seems like miles. I was driving down this narrow gravel track that led into a cedar pocket we were clearing. The track was steep in places, requiring full concentration, especially with a loaded truck. I'd made the run dozens of times that summer and knew every curve and pothole. I came around this sharp bend, driving slower than usual because I'd spotted a deer crossing earlier and didn't want any surprises. That's when I saw it. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. About 50 yards ahead, something huge stepped onto the road from the left side. It crossed the entire width, maybe 15 feet, in 3 strides. Just 3. Its movements were fluid, deliberate, nothing like a bear lumbering across. I hit the brakes instinctively, and the truck skidded slightly on the loose gravel. I wasn't in any danger of hitting it. It was already moving into the dense huckleberry bushes on the right side of the road, but my body reacted before my mind could catch up. It was tall, at least 7 feet, maybe more. The proportions were all wrong for a human, but somehow perfect for what it was. The chest was broad, wider than any man I've ever seen, tapering to a narrower waist. Its arms swung with purpose, longer than they should be, powerful. The hair, and it was definitely hair, not fur, was a dark brown with this reddish tone across the upper body, lighter on the lower half. The hair wasn't matted or tangled like you'd expect on a wild animal. It hung in this strange, almost groomed way. What strikes me most, even now, is that it never looked at me, not once. Despite the noise of my truck, the squeal of brakes, it just kept moving forward with this singular purpose, like I wasn't even there or wasn't worth acknowledging. It disappeared into those huckleberry bushes, which were about 5 feet tall, and just vanished. No rustling, no movement afterward, just gone. I sat there for maybe 5 minutes, engine idling, hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. Part of me wanted to back up, turn around, and get the hell out of there. Another part wanted to get out and look for tracks or evidence. In the end, I did neither. I drove on, completed my run, and tried to convince myself I'd seen a bear walking upright, but I knew it wasn't a bear. I'd seen plenty of bears in my life. This was something else entirely. When I got back to the yard, I didn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? I'd be the laughingstock of the crew. So I kept it to myself, eventually telling only my wife, who looked at me with such confusion and concern that I never brought it up again. The weeks following Jim's encounter in 2000 brought it all back. I found myself waking up at night, remembering details I thought I'd forgotten. The way the muscles moved under the hair, the steam rising from its body in the summer heat, the absolute silence of its passage. What really gets me is the similarity between what I saw and what Jim described. The height, the build, the purposeful movement, and that silence, that unnatural silence. I reached out to Dale to see if I could talk to Jim, but he said the guy had gone completely quiet, wouldn't talk to anyone about what happened that night. When pressed, he just said, "They don't want me talking about it." Who they were, he wouldn't say. But here's what's really been eating at me since this all happened. 2 weeks after Jim's encounter, I was at the Rusty Nail, our local bar, having a beer with Dale and some guys from the mill. This Forest Service ranger named Mike Ellison came in. He's not from around here, transferred from Washington State last year. After a few beers, Mike got to talking about weird stuff he'd seen in his 20 years of service. Someone brought up Jim's Bigfoot shooting and most of the guys laughed, but Mike didn't. He got real quiet, took a long pull of his beer and said, "You know, there's about 800,000 acres of unexplored wilderness in this region. 800,000. We've mapped it, sure, but there are valleys and caves no human has set foot in for centuries, if ever." Then he leaned in and lowered his voice. 2 years ago in Washington, we found a footprint. 17 inches long, 7 inches wide at the ball of the foot. Fresh, made that morning in mud by a creek. We took plaster casts, measurements, photographs. 3 days later, all the evidence disappeared from the ranger station. No explanation. Someone asked him if he believed in Sasquatch. Mike just shrugged and said, "I believe there are things in these woods the government doesn't want us talking about." The conversation moved on, but I couldn't stop thinking about what Mike said, about my own experience, about Jim and those federal agents taking samples. Last week, I drove out near where I had my encounter in '83. The logging road is still there, though overgrown now that the area's been cut. I parked at the bend and walked to the spot where I saw it cross. I don't know what I expected to find after all these years. Closure, evidence, some explanation that would make sense of what I saw. The huckleberry bushes are taller now, maybe 7 feet high. The forest has reclaimed much of the cleared area. As I stood there, I felt it again. That sensation of being watched, of not being alone. I didn't stay long. I still drive the back roads for work sometimes. I still love these forests, but I don't drive them at dusk anymore, and I keep my windows up. Whatever's out there, whatever I saw that day and whatever visited Jim's porch is still out there, moving through these woods, watching us, avoiding us, usually. I just hope I never find out what makes them decide to come onto someone's porch in the middle of a snowy night. What makes them decide that staying hidden isn't important anymore. Story 16. I still don't know how to process what I saw last March. I've told a few close friends, but most just give me that look. You know the one. I've been an avid birder for almost 20 years, spent thousands of hours in the woods, and never once saw anything I couldn't identify. Until that day, it was March 14th, 2017. I remember because it was the first really nice day after a stretch of cold weather, and I'd been itching to get out. I took a day off work to go birding at Sand Creek Wildlife Area near Bloomfield, Iowa. I'd heard through my birding group that some early spring migrants were passing through, and I was hoping to add a few species to my year list. I arrived around 2 in the afternoon and spent several hours hiking the trails, stopping frequently to scan the trees and brush. I spotted a few early warblers, some wood ducks, and even a pileated woodpecker, which is always a treat. I was in a great mood, enjoying the solitude and the crisp air that still had a hint of winter but promised spring. As the afternoon wore on, I made my way toward Pine Hollow Lake, figuring I'd end my day looking for waterfowl before heading home. The sun was getting low, not quite sunset, but that golden hour when everything looks more vivid. I'd guess it was around 5:30 or 6. I reached the east side parking area and stood at the edge where you can see across most of the lake. I remember being pleased that the land management folks had recently cleared some of the brush on the far side of the lake. It made for better viewing than I'd had on previous visits. I set up my spotting scope and started scanning the water's edge for birds, but then switched to my Nikon binoculars for a wider field of view. That's when I noticed the movement. At first, I just caught it in my peripheral vision, something large moving along the western shoreline. My first thought was that it was another birder or maybe a hiker, though I hadn't seen any other cars in the lot. But something about the movement pattern seemed off. It wasn't moving like a person exactly, and it definitely wasn't a deer. It was upright and moving with purpose. I adjusted my binoculars to focus on whatever it was. My hands started trembling slightly as my brain tried to process what I was seeing. There, walking calmly along the water's edge, was a massive figure covered in what looked like dark brown hair or fur. It was walking upright on two legs, arms swinging naturally at its sides with each stride. The creature, I don't know what else to call it, had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe even taller. Its shoulders were incredibly broad, like a football player wearing pads, but this was clearly its natural physique. The proportions were just different from a human's. The legs were long and powerful looking, taking these deliberate strides that covered more ground than a person would with each step. I stood frozen, afraid to move or make any noise, even though I was probably a quarter-mile away across the lake. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my ears. I kept the binoculars trained on the figure, afraid that if I lowered them even for a second, I'd look back and it would be gone, and I'd spend the rest of my life wondering if I'd imagined it. The way it moved was what struck me most. It wasn't lumbering or awkward like you might expect from something so large. It moved with this fluid, natural gait, like it was completely at home in its body and environment. Each step seemed deliberate but effortless. The light was perfect for viewing, that pre-sunset glow that illuminated the creature clearly against the backdrop of trees and water. I could see the hair on its body moving slightly in the breeze. It wasn't shaggy like you see in those blurry photos people share online. The hair looked more uniform, almost sleek in places, especially on the shoulders and upper back. The face was partially obscured from my angle, but I could see enough to tell it had a pronounced brow ridge and what looked like a flattened nose. Its head sat directly on those massive shoulders with barely any neck visible. The head itself was conical-shaped, coming to almost a slight point at the top. For about 5 minutes, though honestly it felt both longer and shorter somehow, I watched this creature walk along the shoreline. It occasionally seemed to pause and look down at the water's edge, almost like it was searching for something. Maybe food. I don't know. It never bent down to pick anything up that I could see. Then, without any apparent reason, it turned slightly toward the tree line. There was no hurry, no indication it had seen or heard anything that alarmed it. It just changed direction and walked into the woods with the same steady pace. Within seconds, the dense trees had swallowed it up completely. I kept my binoculars fixed on that spot for several minutes, hoping it would re-emerge. My arms were getting tired and starting to shake, but I didn't want to miss it if it came back out. Eventually, I had to lower the binoculars. My mouth was bone dry, and I realized I'd been holding my breath without even noticing. The entire encounter happened in complete silence. There were the normal forest sounds, birds calling, the occasional splash of a fish jumping in the lake, but nothing from the direction of the creature. No breaking branches, no vocalizations, nothing. And that's what makes me question myself sometimes, even now. Shouldn't something that large make noise when it moves? But then, I remember how silently black bears can move through dense forest despite their size. And I think maybe this creature has evolved the same way. After waiting about 20 minutes with no further sightings, I started to feel uneasy. The sun was getting lower, and suddenly being alone in the growing darkness didn't seem appealing. I wasn't exactly scared. The creature hadn't shown any aggression or even awareness of me, but I felt exposed somehow, like I'd witnessed something I wasn't supposed to see. I packed up my gear with trembling hands and kept glancing across the lake as I did. The walk back to my car felt longer than it had earlier in the day. Every snapping twig or rustle in the underbrush made me jump. By the time I reached my car, I was practically jogging. I sat in my car for a few minutes with the doors locked, trying to process what I'd seen. I've spent enough time in nature to know the difference between a bear, a moose, or any other large mammal native to this region. What I saw wasn't any of those. Its proportions, its movement, its entire presence was unlike anything I've encountered in 20 years of outdoor activities. The drive home was a blur. I remember stopping at a gas station about halfway and just sitting there, wondering if I should tell anyone. Who would believe me? I've always been the skeptical one in my friend group, the one who finds the logical explanation for strange sightings or sounds in the woods. And now here I was, having seen something I couldn't explain. I didn't take any pictures or videos. It happened so fast, and I was so focused on observing through my binoculars that reaching for my phone never even crossed my mind until it was too late. That's one of my biggest regrets. Without evidence, it's just another story. I've gone back to Sand Creek several times since then, always bringing a camera with a zoom lens in addition to my birding equipment. I've spent hours staring at that same western shoreline, hoping for another glimpse. Nothing. Sometimes I wonder if land management clearing that area was what allowed me to see it at all, a brief window of visibility into a world that normally stays hidden from us. I've read accounts from others who claim to have seen similar creatures, and many details match my experience. The fluid movement, the proportions, the way it just disappeared into the forest. Before my sighting, I would have approached these stories with healthy skepticism. Now, I don't know what to think. I'm not claiming I saw Bigfoot or Sasquatch or whatever you want to call it. I'm just sharing what I observed. A large, hair-covered bipedal creature walking with purpose along a lakeshore in rural Iowa. Something that matched no known animal I'm familiar with after decades of wildlife observation. The encounter has changed me in ways I didn't expect. I'm more alert in the woods now, more aware of my surroundings. I find myself scanning tree lines and listening more intently to forest sounds, not out of fear, but curiosity. If these creatures exist and have managed to remain largely undocumented despite our intrusion into their habitats, what does that say about our understanding of the natural world? I've told exactly 3 people about what I saw: my wife, my brother, and my closest friend. My wife believes me because she knows I'm not prone to exaggeration or flights of fancy. My brother is skeptical but respectful. My friend thinks I misidentified a bear or a person in hunting gear. Maybe they're right. Maybe the light played tricks on my eyes, or my mind filled in details that weren't there. But I know what I saw. 7+ feet of muscle and hair, walking upright with a confidence and grace that no human in a costume could replicate. Moving through the landscape like it belonged there more than I did. And sometimes, when I'm birding alone in quiet places, I can't shake the feeling that I'm the one being watched now. Story 17. I've been struggling with whether to share this for months now. I'm not someone who's big on putting my business out there, but after what I saw back in November, I honestly need some perspective from others who might have experienced something similar. I can't stop thinking about it, and it's making me question everything I thought I knew about our woods. For context, I'm a lifelong hunter. Been doing it since I was 10 years old with my dad in northern Michigan. I own about 40 acres bordering Manistee National Forest that's been in my family for generations. Nothing fancy, just a small cabin, some decent hunting land, and plenty of peace and quiet. At least, that's what I thought. Back in November 2020, I was running 3 trail cameras to track deer movement. Been doing it for years. It's routine for me. I had them set up along this narrow creek bed that cuts through my property. The deer use it as a natural path, especially in the morning and evening when they're moving between bedding areas and feeding grounds. That Sunday morning was brutally cold. Probably mid-20s with a wind that cut right through you. I remember my breath hanging in the air as I hiked out to check my cameras. The first 2 were in pretty accessible spots, maybe half a mile from the cabin. I'd check them weekly, swap memory cards, and be on my way. The 3rd camera, though, that's the one that changed everything. I'd placed it much deeper in, probably close to the edge of my property where it gets really swampy. Not many hunters bother going back there because it's a pain to access, but I'd seen some decent buck sign the previous season and wanted to monitor it. I collected all 3 memory cards that morning, nothing unusual about any of it. Just another day. Made my way back to the cabin, kicked off my boots by the door, made some coffee, and sat down at my little folding table to review the footage on my laptop. The first 2 cards showed exactly what I expected. Handful of does, couple small bucks, nothing worth writing home about. Got a coyote passing through on the second camera. Also caught the same damn raccoon that's been messing with my cameras for months. Little bastard actually knocked one over, and I had about 2 hours of sideways footage of absolutely nothing. When I plugged in the third card, the one from way back in the swamp, I wasn't expecting anything different. First few days were normal, some deer, birds, nothing special. But as I'm clicking through the images from 3 nights before, I noticed something off. It was a series that started around 2:30 in the morning. At first, I just saw movement in the trees, maybe 60 yards back. The camera had triggered, but I couldn't make out what caused it. Just a disturbance among the trees, something moving. I figured maybe a deer, though it seemed odd for how they typically move. The next image, time-stamped just seconds later, showed something I still can't fully explain. There was a figure walking through the trees on 2 legs. My first thought was trespasser, maybe some idiot poacher on my land. But something about the proportions was wrong. Way too tall, too bulky for a normal person, especially with winter clothes on. I kept clicking through, and with each photo, this thing was getting closer to the camera. It moved with purpose, like it knew the camera was there. Not running or anything, just steadily approaching. The way it moved between frames, it didn't look like a human gait, too fluid, too sure-footed in the dark. By the time I got to the images time-stamped around 3 a.m., I felt sick to my stomach. The figure was now just feet from the camera, close enough that the infrared flash illuminated its features, close enough that I could see details I've been trying to forget ever since. The face was, God, I don't even know how to describe it. It had these deep-set eyes, so dark I couldn't see any whites in them. Heavy brow ridge, almost like someone took a Neanderthal sketch from a textbook but made it more intelligent looking. Its nose was flat and wide, nostrils flared slightly. The mouth was partially open, showing what looked like normal teeth, thank God, not fangs or anything horror movie-like. But it made it look like it was breathing heavy or about to speak. The hair is what got me though, dark brown, almost black, hanging down in matted strands around its face and shoulders. Not like a wig or a costume. It looked natural, like it grew that way, too consistent with the skin to be fake. But the worst part, the absolute worst part, was its eyes. It was looking directly into the camera, not with surprise or fear like you'd expect from an animal caught in a flash. It was studying it, like it understood exactly what the camera was. There was an intelligence there that made my blood run cold. That was the final image on the card. Nothing after that 3 a.m. shot, just blackness. I must have sat there for an hour, just staring at that last image. I kept going back and forth between the shots, looking for some sign that it was a hoax or a weird shadow or anything that would make sense. But it was too clear, too detailed. The more I stared, the more certain I became that whatever was in those photos wasn't human. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? My cabin suddenly felt exposed, vulnerable. Every creak in the floorboards, every whistle of wind made me jump. I kept the shotgun by my bed and checked the locks maybe 20 times. I've been alone in those woods hundreds of nights and never once felt afraid until then. When morning finally came, I knew I had to check the camera. Part of me wanted to just pack up and leave, but I needed to know if the camera was still there, if there was any evidence of what I'd seen. I headed out just after sunrise, shotgun in hand. The walk to the third camera felt 10 times longer than it ever had before. Every snap of a twig made me spin around. I kept scanning the tree line, half expecting to see that figure watching me. When I finally reached the camera, my heart sank. It wasn't destroyed or missing. Almost would have preferred that. Instead, It had been carefully turned about 45 degrees to the left, just enough that it was no longer pointing at the game trail. Not ripped down or smashed, just adjusted. Like something, had deliberately moved it to avoid being captured again. I checked the ground for tracks, but it had frosted overnight, and the ground was too hard to show anything clear. There were some depressions in the fallen leaves, larger than deer tracks, but nothing distinct enough to photograph or cast. I stood there debating whether to fix the camera position or just grab it and run. In the end, I left it exactly as I found it. Something about moving it back felt like a challenge I wasn't prepared to make. I just backed away, keeping my eyes on the tree line the whole time, and got the hell out of there. That was 3 months ago. I haven't been back to check that camera since. I can't bring myself to go that deep into the property anymore, especially alone. The camera's still out there, probably still recording, but those memory cards can stay right where they are for all I care. I've heard all the stories about Bigfoot and Sasquatch my whole life, always thought they were bullshit, campfire stories to scare kids. But what I saw in those photos doesn't match the descriptions. It wasn't some giant ape man. This thing had awareness, purpose. The way it looked into the camera wasn't animal curiosity, it was recognition. The locals around here have stories about the Michigan dogman and other creatures, but nothing quite matches what I saw. I've thought about sharing the photos online, but something stops me every time I consider it. Maybe I'm afraid of being called a hoaxer. Maybe I'm afraid of being right. I still hunt the front part of my property, still use the cabin, but I always leave before dark now. And I find myself constantly looking over my shoulder, scanning the tree line, listening for footsteps that sound just a little too deliberate to be an animal. I know what some of you are thinking. Why not show the photos? Truth is, I'm not sure where they are anymore. After that night, I transferred them to a USB drive and deleted them from my laptop. Couldn't stand having them on there. The drive is somewhere in my house in town, purposely misplaced in a way that only makes sense to my rattled brain. Sometimes I think about going back to check that camera, setting up more cameras, trying to understand what's out there. But then I remember those eyes looking into the lens, that awareness, and I decide some questions are better left unanswered. I'm not saying it was Bigfoot or anything specific. I honestly don't know what it was. All I know is that something intelligent enough to recognize a trail camera, tall enough to make a grown man feel small, and deliberate enough to adjust the camera rather than destroy it, is living in the woods behind my cabin, and it knows I've seen it. Anyone else experience anything like this? I'm not looking for people to tell me I'm crazy. I know what I saw. I just need to know if I'm alone in seeing it.